I want to start with a quote from your hyper viral talk on the Oxford debate stage. You're talking about woke culture. And so in the quote, you're going to say this side. So I just want people to know this side means this side of the debate effectively. And we on this side of the house are not on this side of the house because we do not wish to improve the world. We sit on this side of the house because we know that the way to improve the world is to work, is to create, it is to build. And the problem with woke culture is that it's trained too many young minds like yours to forget about that. I want to know, why is it training people to forget about that? There has to be a reason, and there has to be a reason that that's catching on.
Well, why can have two meanings, can't it? Because you can have the what for meaning or why as and because of, right? And I don't think there's much of a what for. I think it's much more of a because. I think victimhood sells well. People in our current society believe that being a victim gives you advantages because it does. Because it does. If you say, I'm an immigrant, which I am, therefore, and you list a bunch of things that are difficult for you, it's weaponized empathy. We live in a society where we believe that being a victim has some kind of moral value almost, right? And so I think we are training kids by incentives. We're incentivizing victimhood. And so people are becoming, it's like these kids who are like 0.0001% Native American and stuff. Like, why would you do that? Why are we now seeing increasingly people identify into groups that we're supposedly told are being discriminated against? People claiming to be things that they're not actually, in order to find themselves in a position where they can say, well, I'm a victim too. Right. So I don't think there's any grand plan behind it. I believe human beings respond to incentives. And if you incentivize victimhood, then you're going to get victims.
Okay, I'm with you on that. But it feels like this kind of thing is going to arise at certain times in history. So I started saying to basically anybody who would listen, this is probably 15 years ago, maybe more, that some people need to be chased by a lion. And it was me sort of grappling with this idea of people latching on to ideas that felt like there's nothing in your life crowding out you seeking a fight. And because the fight for survival isn't your daily reality and things aren't hard, now all of a sudden you find yourself drifting towards things that don't yield the desired outcome because you're not in a life or death situation. And so I'll back that off and say, because I'm in business and the business itself is constantly in a life or death situation, you just become so pragmatic, and you have to look at data and you have to look at what is working, what is not working. And so there's a quote from Thomas Sowell that I've just become obsessed with, which is, the last 30 years have been marked by exchanging what worked for what sounds good.
Yes.
And I'm just like, that makes sense. But I want those things to be true. Those things being like some of the ideas of communism and stuff, they really sound awesome. But in reality, like, the numbers just don't bear it out. And so that idea, I wonder if the ideas of what divides the culture war of victim mentality, I wonder if those incentives became incentives because we actually have it so good. There's no longer a fight that's banging down your door, and it almost becomes a belief system that only people in luxury can have.
Yes, and. So I think there are two parts to it. I think yes, that, and as you were talking, the line that came to me is life is suffering. Is that Buddhist? Is that what the Buddhists say?
The Buddhists certainly say that suffering arises from desire. I don't know if they say flat out life is suffering, but it certainly sounds like something
life
they
is
might.
Suffering. Yeah.
The idea is out there.
The idea is out there that life is suffering, and so if you don't have suffering, then you're going to create it for yourself. And I don't have a great grand theory of this, but my own experience of life is that the very best things that I've experienced are as a result of overcoming adversity. It's the most fulfilling thing. And not least because when you overcome adversity, it gives you the most powerful feeling that you can have, that I've ever experienced, which is the being in control of your life. It gives you the illusion, and it is just an illusion, of being in control of your life. And so I think when you don't have that adversity, you're likely to end up in a position where you look for it elsewhere. You look for things to overcome. So yes, prosperity and comfort and safety and all these things that we enjoy in the modern West, I think, produce this. But also, you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about Thomas Sowell, who's just, I mean,
brilliant.
He's legit. The point that you make about substituting things that work for things that sound good is so apt to the current moment because of the internet and because of social media. Because a lot of the communication about these issues is a product of a medium which rewards ideas that sound good and punishes ideas that sound bad. If I say to you, what are some of the things that sound good? All things to all people, look after everybody, blah, 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 blah. Sounds good. What if I say to you, your life is your responsibility? It's up to you to make what you want out of your opportunities and the difficulties that you experience. No one's coming to save you. No one, right? We both know this. No one's coming to save you. But it doesn't sound good. It sounds terrible. And so if you have a system which amplifies ideas that sound good but don't work, that is how you end up in the position that we're ending up in. And increasingly, some of these ideas are beginning to clash with reality. And that's really the big narrative collapse that I see coming is at some point, these things will get so bad that reality will come and slap us in the face very, very hard.
That's my big fear.
Yeah.
So when I look at what's going on, when a society gets to the point that we're at where we're just hyper affluent, like even, obviously there is a point where people don't have enough calories and okay, they have truly fallen off the ladder. But even for people that are in poverty, and I have seen poverty up close, we were talking before we started rolling, I have gotten to know a lot of people that have grown up in the inner cities. And so I've been inside their homes and I big brothered for a kid in Compton and South Central. He moved around for 8.5 years. So I really, really got to see it up close. They have refrigerators, they have air conditioning, they have homes, but the neighborhoods are deadly. And there is fundamental things about it that are completely broken, but there are so many luxuries that we take for granted. And so as I was looking at that, and I had 1,000 employees that grew up in the inner cities, and I was like, wow, this isn't a money problem. This is a ideas problem. They have a mindset that is moving them backwards. But when I say that, I know how much that riles people up, but it goes back to what you said about it doesn't sound good to say that you're in control, that nobody's coming to save you. But that's what works. And so if you take Kobe Bryant's advice, it's rapidly becoming my favorite quote, which is that boos don't block dunks. And the idea that you can get so good at something that people can't stop you from succeeding. Now that puts you in a position to be aggressive in skill acquisition. If you get aggressive in skill acquisition and you meet minimum requirements, there is a certain amount of intelligence, which is why I love that there's a social safety net and I believe in all that. And I think it's wonderful because there's some people that just aren't going to be able to compete in that sort of realm. But once you embrace, okay, wait a second, nobody's coming to save me, but I can get so good at something that matters. It could be being a school teacher. It doesn't have to be running a business or whatever, but I can get so good at that thing that I will always be able to make ends meet. I'll always be able to have a roof over my head, comfort, etc. But that when we're in this state where we have that sort of default level of comfort, that you get into a positive feedback loop where your ideas, because your ability to eat is not hanging in the balance, that you end up in a situation where your ideas never get put to that life or death test. And so you can embrace ideas that aren't going to force you to move yourself forward. And when you're in that situation, there's nothing to unwind it. There's nothing to point out, this is a bad idea and it's not going to lead anywhere until it all collapses and the society breaks. And now people are in the kind of pain and suffering that you need to be in to make radical change. And Ray Dalio really outlines this well with the 6 stages that any empire goes through. And the 6th stage is total collapse. It's usually war, and that's the transition from 5 to 6. And he puts us in halfway through phase 5. And for anybody, or stage 5, for anybody that doesn't know, Ray Dalio built the largest hedge fund in the world. This is a guy who's put his money where his mouth is, bet that his assessment of the global macroeconomic situation is accurate, and won more than anyone else in history. And he's saying, hey, boys and girls, you're at stage 5.5. And when you look at that, do you see a way out of this? Do you see a way to get people to exchange what sounds good for what works?
I don't want to give you an answer that sounds good but doesn't work. I don't know is the truth, Tom. All I know is what my mission is in this space. That's all. All I know is I've got to say what I'm saying. I've got to try and wake people up to make them aware. Is it futile? I genuinely don't know. I just know that those of us who are aware of this issue have a duty to say something and have a duty to try and bring people to that understanding. Because if we don't, and I keep making this point wherever I go, we don't operate in a vacuum. There are other people in other places who would also like to be prosperous, who would also like to be comfortable, who would also like to be powerful. And they aren't teaching their children that their country is shit. They're not teaching their children that the history of their country is defined by the worst elements of it. They're teaching their children to be strong, confident, intelligent, well-educated to the extent that they can with the resources that they have. Whereas we are doing the opposite. We are using our tremendous resources to teach young people to hate their own country. And I'm not as smart as the guy that you're talking about in terms of being able to plot out the course of civilization. I'm just saying, look, maybe this isn't a good recipe for the success of our civilization and our society. And the reason I think that matters is that I have lived in places, many places, that are not the Western world, that do not operate by the same rules, that do not value the things that we value. And who's to say that, some people would argue that, the Chinese have their own value system and the Russians have their own, and they're all relative to each other and blah, 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 blah. Who knows who's right or wrong? I just know that for me and for people who are like me and who think like me, the preservation and survival and flourishing of the West is very, very important, because the sort of things that we believe in, the sort of values that we have, they don't survive well in those other cultures. They're not celebrated or encouraged or...
What are Western values?
So I think there are several. I mean, one of them, and the crucial one, is the sanctity of the individual. This is the most important thing that separates us from everybody else, certainly from many other major civilizations. So if you look at, for example, what's happening in Ukraine right now, Vladimir Putin has absolutely no hesitation about sending hundreds of thousands of men to die in Ukraine for a small piece of land, because the individual is not that valuable. Indeed, in Russian mythology, not mythology as in, gods, but, the myths that a society tells itself about itself. The sacrifice of the ordinary citizen for the monarch, for the leader, is a noble and brilliant thing. And this kind of, we lost 20 million people in World War II. And yet people in Russia prior to this war and now, they would drive around Moscow with bumper stickers that said, we can do this again. Right? Because we defeated Nazism. And the fact that it cost us 20 million lives due to incompetence and all sorts of other things that happened under Stalin that made that war so bloody and brutal, that's fine. It's not a problem. We won, and we can do it again, right? The Chinese, again, the way their attitude to, COVID happens, let's lock you in your home. It's fine. I remember there was I don't know if you saw this, there was a clip of a drone flying around outside of one of these apartment blocks in Beijing somewhere, which said, you must suppress your something like unnatural desire for liberty or something like that, right?
Wow.
I may be misquoting, but the sense of it, the sense was the same. So the central thing of Western civilization is, to me at least, that I see, is the idea that you matter. You as an individual matter. Your rights matter. You have value in and of yourself by being a human being in a way that other civilizations don't, because they're much more collectivist in nature. And so sacrificing, it's like if you had to cut off a toe to save your whole body. That's a good deal, right? And that's how a lot of other cultures think about individual human beings too. We don't. We generally don't. We don't think about it in that way. We value the individual. And then on top of that, with that comes a whole slew of other things. If the individual is valuable and is sacred in some way, that means that individual has a right to express their opinions. They have a right to pursue happiness. This is written into the American Constitution. They have a bunch of things that they're entitled to do, to speak their mind, to research the things in science that they want to do. And in my view, one of the reasons that we are successful in terms of science and technology is we have the culture that produces better science and technology because of those freedoms, right? And this is the point I've always tried to make to people in the West, is like the fact that we sit in this lap of luxury and technological sophistication and advancement and comfort is a product of our cultural values and our history. It's not all about colonialism. It's also about the fact that we had a certain way of looking at the world that was closer to creating the reality that we have than other ways of looking at the world, right? And it's the preservation of that way of looking at the world that I think is really important. And the part of the problem with what's going on now, and one of the reasons that I oppose, whatever you want to call it, progressivism or wokeness or whatever, is precisely because it is antithetical to those values. The idea, for example, that human beings should be treated on the content of their character is not an idea that really exists anywhere in the world, fundamentally, other than the West. The idea in Russia, the idea that like a gay man is equal to a straight man is absurd. Would never occur to someone to think in that way. Gay people are a minority. Look, we don't always have to beat them up, but they're not real men, right? That's a large part of how many people in that country would think. If you're a Uyghur in China, again, no one cares about your rights. You go in a camp. And what bothers me about what we're doing in Western society is we're undoing this very novel and quite radical idea by human standards that it doesn't matter what your skin color is. It doesn't matter what your sex is. We are going to try to treat each other on the basis of the fact that we're both individuals and connect with each other through our minds and through our hearts without looking at all the superficial meat suit shit that doesn't actually matter, right? That to me is valuable, and I'm not prepared to be quiet when people try and throw it out the window.
It's really interesting. So the fundamental schism being the collective versus the individual, certainly an argument that I find very compelling. The thing that I think that addresses that, it's very out of fashion, is that idea plants the overcoming of things like slavery, like bigotry, like having a problem. Like if you go back, you don't have to go back very far to see gay people being just absolutely ostracized, and yet now being more and more welcomed. Because it's like, if there is, and I'm not religious, but I like the idea of there's a spark of divinity inside every human. There's something special. There's something sacred. And when you have that idea becomes a bit of a mind virus. And so even though it takes a distressing amount of time for these ideas to work their way in, you can go from the people that write the Constitution end up writing in this mind virus of all men are created equal, when obviously at the time that they write it, they don't mean it literally, but it plants an idea in people's minds, and that idea ends up taking over. And this is where, and I don't know that I've thought through all of this well enough to be like, plant a flag and say, this is my take on it, which is actually one of the things I want to talk to you about, is how difficult these ideas are to work through, which is part of how I think we end up here. But so you have this mind virus that they plant in themselves. It takes hold, and over time it keeps, when people say the long arc of history bends towards justice, when you have ideas like that. And now what's weird though is this becomes an Ouroboros for people that have ever seen that image of the dragon eating its own tail. It's like the very idea of and I'm now stretching beyond what I've ever said out loud before. So if you can help me adjust course here, by all means, you get, by giving that sort of spark of divinity and having that idea in people's minds, you then get to the point of my lived truth. The way that I feel matters. Yes. I am the divine. And so what I perceive is therefore real. And so it becomes this weird moment. And I have so much love and empathy for people that end up here, because the thing I've struggled with in my life is my intellect is just limited enough that I really struggle with like super nuanced things. I feel like over time I can get somewhere useful, but I have a lot of empathy for people that get lost in some of the nuance. So as you view yourself as having that spark of divinity, that what I feel is so true that for others to not recognize that is somewhat of a personal affront. And if you're thinking that in a society where, for the most part, like your basic needs are going to be met, you now get in a point where you haven't had the reality smacking you in the face that you were talking about that forces you to confront, I don't think this is working. And that gets us what we have now, which is very well-intentioned people that are lovely, beautiful humans that have value in the spark of divinity, but their ideas are no longer bending the long arc of history towards justice.
It's a very interesting thought. And I think one of the things that went unsaid there, but is fundamentally at the core of it, is that society only works, and I say this as an agnostic, if there is a religious superstructure imposed on top of it, which says, yes, you have the spark of divinity inside of you, but there's something greater than all of us that we are all connected through. And once you take that away and you put the human being on a pedestal, then yes, my lived experience becomes reality, and the denial of my reality becomes violence or an attack on my very identity. That's why we are where we are.
So you're saying that we need a superstructure so here's an interesting idea. Tell me if this jives with what you're saying. The right level of analysis is the individual. That's something Jordan Peterson said that really struck me. Like, as you start to atomize things and think about where should these decisions be made, it will ultimately come down to the individual. I think he's right about that, certainly in a Western context where it's not a collectivist vision. But once you get down to the atomized individual, to avoid sort of ideological chaos, you have to have some sort of superstructure that you exist within. That superstructure could be the Constitution, the democratic experiment that is the United States. It could be religion, but it has to be something. And if we don't have a shared vision of what that superstructure ought to be, and I use that word with moral implications, then we run into the trouble that we're seeing now.
And then you have a very polarized society in which people feel like they're not even living in the same country.
Now, do you think each side of that debate is they have their own superstructure and that's what makes them a coherent side?
Never really thought about that. So you and I are working through some stuff here that I've never really thought about out loud before. So I may say things that I later don't necessarily agree with. But if we're working through it, do they have their own superstructure? Well, I mean, the conservative religious right have a superstructure. And to a certain extent, would we say that the woke left has a superstructure above it? I mean, I think these sort of reachings for institutionalized whatever and systemic whatever, it's an attempt to have a worldview that is just as faith-based as the belief in a divine being, if you think about it, because it's something that exists in the absence of evidence, even if there is some evidence for it. The argument that the Ibrahim X. Kendi types make is that it's a circular reasoning. The absence of racism is only a reflection of the fact that someone is being racist but doesn't realize it. That's kind of how that works, right? So I don't know. The problem is that I think you need a superstructure that is in the words of a good friend of mine who's a Cambridge professor, James Orr, we've just released an interview with him. It's brilliant. We need something that's pre-political. And pre-political. And that is essentially something that we all take for granted, you know. We don't really seem to have that anymore. And that's why I'm so concerned. You know, I'm neither on the right or on the left, but when I see elements of the left go down the path of sort of saying, you know, our countries are terrible, it makes me wonder, well, I don't know if they actually think that, but let's assume that they do. If you thought that this house was terrible, or that your life was terrible, or that the values of your country were terrible, why would you defend them? Why would you fight for them? Why would you teach those values and those ways of being to your children? Right? So if you get to a point where people are no longer willing to understand that, while yes, our society is not perfect, it is the best society available, and it is therefore worthy of protecting and defending and growing as a result, well, then you've kind of got yourself to a position where, you know, I don't see this extreme progressivism as seeking to make America or Britain or the West better. I just see it as attempting to pull things down because they're not good enough, right? That is a problem.
Because you're destroying that superstructure?
Well, I think the superstructure's already kind of been destroyed. You're laying the foundations of a civilization that is incapable of defending itself. I don't mean physically necessarily. I think if the United States was to be attacked, there would be enough people who'd go and fight to defend it right now.
Yeah, but that's a really interesting moment. And so I was literally just taking notes on this idea. So I grew up in the 80s. Arnold Schwarzenegger movies were everything. America was great. Your hometown of Russia was bad.
Yeah.
And it was awesome. And it was awesome because I had clarity. Yeah. I knew that we were the best. I knew that you were the enemy. And that really gave me an anchor.
And we had the same in the Soviet Union, by the way. You were the enemy.
Of course.
We were the great, and everybody was happy.
Yeah. So there, as I think about what the actual note that I took is too many perspectives coming too fast. And so to your point about social media, what ends up happening is every time you try to anchor, this is my idea, somebody hits you with, no, that idea doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, damn, they kind of have a point, but now I feel unmoored again. And so then you're like, I just need a team. Just tell me what team I'm on. And this is how you get into the hyperpolarization, because I need there to be a group of thought so I don't have to think through every issue and contend with all the very intelligent arguments coming at me from both sides, because there are really smart people on both sides with really compelling arguments. And one thing I've learned just as an immutable truth, the reason that you end up in a situation where you have really intelligent people coming at things from exactly opposite ends is that there is truth in both sides. And so this is where then I'm like, okay, the superstructure I want for everybody is first principles. What works? What actually, as we get closer to the laws of physics, and we are able to accurately predict the outcome of our behavior and the behavior of others, you know you're getting closer to ground level truth. And that would be my fantasy, is that we can all get our heads around that. We can say, this is our stated goal. What are the behaviors, the cultural inculcations that we need to do in order to achieve that? So you laid them out, what the West has done, the experiment that we've run, the mind virus of the individual is the right thing to focus on, because that leads to the seeking of truth in scientific realms, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a whole host of other things that are probably better not to completely fractal on right now. So going back to this idea of you've got all of these perspectives coming at you very quickly, you want to start bifurcating into teams so that you have an anchor. You don't have to think through all these different ideas. But the fascinating thing is, even as everything is being eroded, if America were to be attacked, now suddenly you're in that thing where there is real hardship. There is real pain. There's real suffering. When somebody comes and kicks your front door in with a machine gun, it's like, whoa, now like this is really time to react. And moments like that, I think, would be incredibly galvanizing. But again, that comes back to, you need that level of pain and suffering that I really, would love to find a way to avoid. But it's, so going back to the idea of you've got, the way I've always articulated this idea is there is a God-shaped hole in everyone's heart. Now, I'm not religious, so I don't fill that hole with God. I fill that hole with biology. So if there were one thing I'm trying to get across to the world, it is this: you are having a biological experience. Your brain works in a certain way. Once you understand your brain is influenced by your gut, and that whatever 85% of the serotonin in your body, which controls a lot of your mood, is actually made and stored in your gut. Like, that's so startling to me. And thusly, what you eat is going to influence your mood. So now it's like, hey, this divine vehicle that you have, it's a vehicle and it works in a certain kind of way. And if you take care of it, it will work well. And if you don't, it won't. And so that has left me with this tremendous sense of awe and this desire to go inward and understand how I work. And so that fills that thing for me that creates a superstructure, so that when I am left with the atomization of I'm an individual person, I start going, okay, what's my moral compass? My moral compass, given what I just said about biology, the individual, I think it will make sense for people that my moral compass is all about what increases human thriving and decreases human suffering, right? It's going to be something very tactile. It's going to come down to what the individual is going through. And so everybody is going to need that thing for themselves. And I don't think they have that clarity in a world where so many ideas are bombarding them so quickly, and the world that they are in is relatively affluent, and there's nobody with a machine gun knocking on their door. But any crisis like that collapses their ideology down to getting back to first principles. What works in this moment? What keeps me and my family safe right here, right now, in this moment? It cuts out all the bullshit. I don't know if that made sense, but
that made perfect sense, except I would argue it's not true if you look at what happened during COVID. COVID was, for a lot of people, at least initially, an experience that should have been that thing that you talk about. And actually, I don't know if it was the case here, but in the UK, for the first couple of weeks, it legitimately felt like, wow, we've all got something that is affecting all of us, that is scary, that is dangerous. We don't know how dangerous, we don't know how scary, but what we got to do is work together, look after the vulnerable, pull in the same direction.
it was exactly the same here.
It was like that for a few weeks. And then this is going to sound political, but it's not meant political. It's just a statement of fact. And then BLM happened, right? And then all of the hypocrisies of how we treat different groups and all of that stuff suddenly ruined all of that. That's what I saw, right? And this is not even an anti-BLM point. It was just like, you can't have everyone locked in their homes for weeks, and then the moment people want to protest about a particular issue, now going outside without a mask and protesting next to other people is a health intervention.
But this proves my point.
Okay.
Because what happened was, in the first few weeks, we thought that there was a guy with a machine gun kicking down our door.
And
then we realized it's actually not as bad as we thought. Right. But because we were saying, hey, this is as bad or worse than you think it's going to be. And so you could get away with, give me all the control, the authoritarian control, which we need to get into authoritarianism. Yeah. But just to finish this point. So you need to give me all the control because this is really bad. But then the reality of it didn't end up being that. And so the virus didn't spread, especially when you were outside. And so, or didn't spread as fast, I should be very clear. So it didn't spread as fast when you were outside. And so all of the people who were like, oh, but this is going to be crazy. If you're right, this is going to be a super spreader event. And then it wasn't a super spreader event. And so then it was like, is this as dangerous as we think? Like, I remember, dude, washing the grocery bags that would come into my house with sanitizer, sanitizing everything, only buying things that was either prepackaged or that I could sanitize the outside of. I mean, lest people forget how big of a question mark this was. And this is not to take anything away. COVID killed a lot of people, but it wasn't like the Spanish flu of 1918 that killed whatever 50 million people. So this you have these moments where you think a guy with a machine gun is kicking down your door or that you're being chased by a lion, but in the end, you're not. And so it created this really weird dissonance of people were going into camps, but then they still weren't forced to figure out what actually works. And so my thing is, once you start, so I really, this idea, and now I'm speaking as an entrepreneur, and so I'm just in my zone. Everything up till now is me thinking through an idea, and I'm very grateful for people giving me the space to process. But now speaking as an entrepreneur, I will just tell you that to build a business, you must become a fiendish prediction engine. You have to get very good at, if I do this, I will get this result. Because if I don't, I can't pay people's salary. So there's just a really cut and dry thing. You're dealing with the market. The marketplace does not care about you. Like, you just either give something to people that they want more than they want their money, and you can sell it at a profit, or you don't. That's it. It's cut and dry. And so in that, you really start to go, okay, it doesn't matter what I want to be true. Like, just all that bullshit, it's gone. What is true?
Yes.
And you become fiendish to figure that out. And the people that end up doing well are people that get very accurate at going, if I do this thing, I'm going to get this result. If I do that thing, I'm going to get that result. And they get into what I call the physics of progress. I think no matter what you're trying to accomplish in your life, there is a loop. It does not change for anybody that you have to run through. And I mapped this out, and I was teaching it in a business class. And I actually first started teaching it here to my own staff. And one of the guys on my team goes, oh, that's the scientific method. And I was like, oh my God, it is the scientific method. And I realized, okay, when multiple disciplines come to the same conclusion from totally different angles, the odds that that thing is useful in generating a predictive engine is pretty high. And so when that prediction engine can break down because there isn't the level of threat that you thought, this is where all hell breaks loose.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, that makes perfect sense. And let's come back slightly further, because you talked about your own, how you fill the God-shaped hole. And you mentioned that for you, part of that is human flourishing and avoiding human suffering. The problem is those things are subjective, and they're also operating on a subjective timeline. There are things that will cause human suffering now that will cause human flourishing 10 years from now, right? The delayed gratification point. So how you define those things is also subjective, which is why a superstructure cannot reside within you. It has to be something pre-political. It has to be something that other people not just agree with, but other people believe almost without questioning. That's what a superstructure is. And religion provided that very, very well for a period of time. But we are in the West, certainly in a somewhat post-religious age. I mean, maybe not. Maybe that actually will change over time. But the problem I think we're having is that you are right to say that you have a lot of very smart and well-intentioned people from different sides not being able to agree. And I think the reason is, Jonathan Haidt has obviously written about this, that people with different psychological profiles and as a result political visions, they value different things. And so if you are left-leaning or sort of liberal-leaning, compassion is going to be much higher on your list of priorities, whereas someone who's more pragmatic like you is going to say, well, yes, I have to, you are a member of my team and I have to give you a telling off and say, no, you fucked this up, right? But we're going to work together to make sure it doesn't happen again so that you grow as a person and you're more effective. Well, for some people, that's unpleasant and suffering. But if you're interested in growing a business, you know that sometimes you have to get things to work properly. And part of that means telling people things they don't want to hear, right? We talked about this before we started. And I think that's probably a lot of where the disagreement is, because we don't have an overarching superstructure above everybody. Then you end up in a position where it's like, well, if you want to pursue your version of human flourishing and I want to pursue my version of human flourishing, they could look completely differently based on what we believe to be true about the world. Now, yes, I agree with you that you've taken a lot of time clearly and thought very carefully about what it is that works and doesn't work in the real world. Most people haven't. And a lot of them operate on the basis of what makes them feel good, because that's the original mechanism by which human beings existed, right? You feel bad about something, you avoid it. You feel good about something, you pursue it. The world's got more complicated, and so you have to have those loops that you talked about. But a lot of people don't operate through them. And even if they did, you still probably find that because people are different psychologically, they value different things, and they define flourishing and suffering in different ways, which is why I don't think that's enough.
Here's an idea. I would love to hear what you think about this. So the business world has taught me a lot about human nature, and so I maybe take a slightly different approach to everything that's happening right now. So in a business, you absolutely need two different types. You need a dreamer visionary, and you need an executor. And I've seen way too many times really smart people, Konstantin, really smart people. And one of them's a visionary, and he thinks the executor's an idiot. And the executor is brilliant, and he thinks the visionary is an idiot. And you're sitting there watching it going, wait, how have you guys gotten this far without realizing it's the tension between the two of you that actually finds the right path? And so in business, it's often talked about as the kite and the string. So if you have a kite that has no string, it just flies off into nothingness, crashes into a tree, falls to the ground, whatever. If you have a string without a kite, obviously it just lays on the ground. So you need the two in dynamic tension. And if the kite were angry at the string and thought the string was useless and a fool, and the string thought the kite was, a good for nothing, then it's just mayhem. And that's what I feel like is happening politically. And dude, I'm not a political person. I never thought I would ever have a conversation like this, or I would ever need to think through these problems. And then I started realizing, oh, this is like the left and right debate. Again, on my tombstone, I wanted to read, you're having a biological experience. And what I want people to understand is evolution has just molded the life out of you. And you are a product of a lot of evolution. And evolution is 100% trying to make sure that you have kids that survive long enough to have kids. Okay, when you've got a lot of lions chasing you, you need a strong group. So there's going to be this, nature is going to make sure that there's cohesion in a group. But what makes for cohesion? Strong individuals. Okay, cool. So we're going to have a collectivist versus individual tension. And because if you don't, you get what's called the freeloader problem. So if everybody is like, no man left behind, like we've got to take care of everybody. From an evolutionary standpoint, you just created a game theoretic gap, and somebody's going to go, oh, word? Nobody left behind? I'll be chilling here. Go get me some food. Bring it back. Group says you have to take care of me, all is well. And so if you had that, then everybody becomes the freeloader, and then you die off. So you have to have this countervailing force that's like, no way, like I will take care of you, but I need to know that you're going to take care of me too the next time. And so now you've got the tension between the two. You've got somebody who's like saying, hey, you're accountable for everything. Your life is your choice. Nobody's coming to save you. You better get out there and hunt. Then you've got somebody else that's like, yo, you can't be like that. You have more than you can eat. Come on, share with the group. And so when you get the dynamic tension between those two, you have a functioning society. But when you have each side going, you're an idiot, you don't belong here, my way is the only way, it devolves into madness.
Yes.
And so I will point people back to being an entrepreneur, which I did not plan to quote on this so much. Ray Dalio, guy I mentioned earlier, builds the largest hedge fund in the world, billions and billions of dollars. This guy's crazy. His success is ridiculous. And it's all on the back of this horrendous failure. And so he's probably mid-30s. He's the wonderkind. Like, he's just the guy. And he's killing it. And he lays out this whole strategy. And he tells the world, like, this is what's going to happen. He puts all in on it. Chips start going his way. He looks like a genius. And then it stalls. And it doesn't go his way, and he loses everything, man. He goes from being ultra wealthy to having to borrow money to pay rent and put groceries on his kid's table. I mean, just the most catastrophic fall you can imagine. And so he's like, okay, I'm going to start all over again, and I'm going to reboot everything. But I'm going to have one guiding force, and that is the recognition of the fallibility of my thinking. And I am no longer going to see myself as super smart. I'm going to see myself as somebody who absolutely must cultivate in others the willingness to tell me when I'm wrong and why I'm wrong. And so this got me obsessed with free speech. So I think that we are all, no matter how smart you are, literally no matter how smart, You're going to be blind to something.
100%.
And if you don't live in a world where people can tell you, are encouraged, that you invite them to tell you where you're wrong, you will implode at some point.
Do you know what I do with my guys at Trigonometry?
No.
I'm always starting arguments. I'm always like, so what do you think about this? No, but I can see you don't quite agree with me. And I do this all the time. And this is the beauty of what, we have me, Francis, and our producer, Anton, like the core team, and then a bunch of other people. And that's what I've always tried to do, because while it's very tempting to think I'm a very smart person, I also recognize the different perspectives and people, you said the biological experience. I mean, the biological experience can drive you into all sorts of cul-de-sacs, both intellectually and emotionally, right? So that is, I couldn't agree with you more, man. It's so important that we are able to challenge ourselves and be challenged by others. To me, I don't actually know a lot about leadership, because it's a new thing to me, having our team, but it's something I've thought often about, which is, I think, that's such a difficult balance to strike between being a strong, confident, assertive leader who has vision and takes the team forward, but also someone who can not only just hear feedback, but actually encourage it so that it's given in the first place. And that's kind of what I've always tried to work on since, I remember when we were about to hire our first staff member, I was dreading it. Because I knew I wasn't prepared, but there's only one way to prepare, which is to do it, right? So yeah, and free speech is to broaden it out as you have. I think that's right. And that is why, the scientific progress we talked about earlier is a product of that, because it's the ability to challenge ideas.
How much would you give up for free speech? How far would you let people go?
Well, it depends what you mean, because for example, in certain countries in Europe, it is illegal to deny the Holocaust, right?
In Konstantin land, is that okay?
Denying the Holocaust?
Yeah.
It is to me, yeah. And, I have family who've died in that war and who were Jewish. I don't personally want to... But we've got ourselves into a bit of a confusion as a society, because people confuse, you won't have a Holocaust denier on your podcast. That means you don't believe in free speech. That's a slightly different conversation.
Agreed.
Right? But I do think people should be allowed... Look, this isn't a popular view, particularly. As someone who has experienced racism, I don't think it should be illegal to be racist, right? To say racist things. Right? It should be illegal to discriminate against people because of their race in employment and in education or wherever. But people should be allowed to have and express pretty much any opinion, in my view. I recognize that's not how other people think.
Do you think that's if the scales had to tip one way or the other, do we lean more towards people believing in free speech now in the West, or away from it?
Well, I think the scales is the wrong metaphor, because I think there's some people who very strongly feel free speech is important, and there are also some people who feel very strongly that feelings and protecting people from hearing things they don't like is very important. So I don't know what the balance of that is, because I think those camps are almost separate. They're not even on the same scale to some extent, right? I think if you were to poll the ordinary person, it depends country by country. I mean, in the UK, we have laws against, it's illegal in the UK to be grossly offensive.
That freaks me out.
It freaks me out.
When did that happen?
I believe it was brought in under the Blair government. Don't quote me on this. I could be wrong, but that's fairly recent,
right.
Actually.
Yeah.
So between 1997 and 2010, it would have come in at that point, maybe even before. But it was never really robustly enforced if it had been in place. So don't quote me on it. But it's a relatively new occurrence.
Right. It's not from the 1800s.
I don't believe so. And if it is, I don't recall. When I was growing up in the UK, I don't remember hearing about people being prosecuted or arrested, or even having the police visit them for things that they said. And now it happens. And it freaks me out. You're right. And it should freak us out.
Yeah. Where do you think that, where does the denial of free speech go?
Well, you charted it perfectly yourself. If we cannot challenge bad ideas, bad ideas thrive. And when bad ideas thrive, that disconnect between reality and ideas gets wider and wider. And then you and I have both, I think, explained where that leads. It leads to the clash with reality. I mean, you can believe that gravity is not real as long as you want, but when you jump out of a window, you're going to find out.
Talk to me about Russia, because I think there's another element to this where I watched the movie Chernobyl, and it really freaked me out. Like how being watched all the time, knowing that there are certain things that you can say and can't say, like what it does to the psyche and how it can lead to a nuclear disaster because you're not able to speak up. You're not able to just plain say, hey, asshole, like I can't do that because this is going to fucking melt down.
Yeah.
You were born in Russia. What does it do, like, to the vibe? I'm not sure what the right word is to use, but like, what does it do to the society when people aren't able to just be open and honest? Because there's really like fear of punishment.
Well, a lot of people, it's obviously not comparable, but a lot of people know what that feels like now, because a lot of people worry about expressing their actual opinions in public. And it was funny because I was just in New York. We've just done a couple of weeks of a trip around the US. And I got invited to this thing that's run by a friend of mine called Thought Criminals. And it's a small group of people who get together and talk about things that they believe that they can't talk about in public or in their work and whatever. And they asked us, Francis and I, to speak a little bit. And, I said to them, I've been in this room before. Because even in the 1980s, I remember as a little kid running around in, my grandfather's kitchen, and there would be, physicists and biologists and musicians and artists sitting around in a small kitchen talking about the very things that they could not discuss elsewhere.
That's a lot of trust, man.
Yeah. And it didn't always work out. So in my grandfather's case, in one of gatherings of this kind, he criticized the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And within very short order, he was fired from his job. His wife was fired from her job, and both their children, that's my father and my aunt, were kicked out of university. He had the KGB search his house. They found a radio receiver that he used to listen to BBC World Service and Voice of America, and you couldn't. You were not allowed to. This was a terrible crime. And so eventually that's actually in part why I ended up in England, because he couldn't remain in the Soviet Union. And as it was sort of tapering out at the end, he left and went to the UK. And then when my parents had a bit of money, they sent me to boarding school to England to be there. But my point is, it creates, and to this day, we don't actually know what people in Russia think about the war, for example. We don't. Because what polling says isn't necessarily reflective, because Russians learn, and other people in the Soviet Union learn over a long period of time, that you have a public reality, you have a work reality, and then you have the kitchen table reality. And some of these can be in complete contradiction to each other. And it creates a culture of fear in which, as you say, people are afraid to speak up, people are afraid to take initiative. That's the worst thing. Imagine a business where people don't take initiative because they're afraid. How, if you have a bunch of people working for you, how bad would the product that you produce be if none of them ever felt able to say, actually, why don't we do it like this? Let's try that. You see what I'm saying? If everybody was constantly worried about protecting their job and therefore didn't innovate, didn't do anything different, didn't try things, didn't challenge authority, didn't challenge the people above them and so on. Like that, it's a very stifling atmosphere. And it's extraordinary to me how successful the Soviet Union was in competing with the world superpower in spite of that system. It shows you the incredible talents and intellect of the people of the former Soviet Union, who really, punched above their weight, in my opinion, given the terrible structures that they were operating in.
Yes, this is the thing that scares me, and this is why I think what we're calling it, this will be interesting. I'll try to dissect my own argument here. This is the thing that I find terrifying, is that even in a country like that has what I would call very bad ideas, they are able to be successful to a certain point. And so somebody that's going to attack me, if I were going to steel man their argument, I would say, Look at China. Look at what they've done. Look at Russia. Look at what they did. I mean, they, for a long time, they were the other superpower. And yes, they've had sort of a blip, and for a while they struggled, but it's like, you know, they're kind of coming back. Like, depending on how you look at what Putin is doing, God, this is not me saying this, I want to be very clear, but like reunifying, you know, the country, or however it's thought of. And so as somebody who has read the Gulag Archipelago, who's read Mao, The Unknown Story, who's read The Red Famine, Jesus, it really is... It's really distressing depending on what it is that you value, because this stuff will go on for a long time. Like, a lot of people died in the Red Famine, but the country didn't go away. Like, they still, like, they managed to, like, you know, figure some things out and keep going. And even when the Soviet Union fell, it's not like Russia fell into the sea. Like, they, you know, they build back and countries fragment, but they start doing their own thing. And so it really comes down to, what vibe do you get when you think about, and I'll just make this about work, as you were talking, I was like, oh man, that's actually a really good analogy. The way that I view what happens when you lose free speech is what most people experience every day at work, where, oh, think about how much, like, you think your boss is an idiot, but you're like, I can't say anything because if I do, then I'm going to get fired or whatever. That's what it would be like. And so I don't know why people are racing towards it when they're busy hating their job and they think, you know, they work for a moron, but they can't say anything, and they complain about it and they want out and they want to do their own thing. But yet there's like this cultural movement that will yield the same result. So at Impact Theory, dude, you can't imagine how many times to my own team I've given the speech. Nobody here is above criticism, least of all me. I am not smart enough to take us where we want to go. I need people to tell me when I'm going awry. I need people, like, you are literally being hired for two things. Are you willing and able to make decisions and stand by them? And can you speak to power? Because if you can't speak to power and you're not willing to tell me what you really think, we're going to crash and burn. Have you heard about South Korean Airlines and how they used to have the worst safety record in the entire industry? Okay, this is crazy. This to me is what happens when free speech goes away. So they have a cultural thing there where you respect your elders. Yes. So if the captain outranks you and you're in the plane and you're the co-pilot and something's going wrong, you can make suggestions, but you can't like snap them out of it. And so they have these black box recordings. Dude, this eerie. They did this whole documentary of black box reenactments of these famous plane crashes. And there were a couple in there from South Korea. And it goes like this. Excuse me, pilot, do you think we're getting a little close to that mountain? No, everything's fine. Excuse me, sir, could it be possible that if we were to pull up, that we would be in a better situation? I told you to maintain your course. They are careening towards a fucking mountain, man. They eventually crash into that mountain. And at no point does the co-pilot go, hey, motherfucker, we're going to run into the mountain and we need to pull up. What the fuck are you doing? And that, to me, is when you lack free speech, you get Chernobyl. Watch it if you haven't. You get South Korean Airlines. They finally had to do this whole like cockpit protocol where in the cockpit you could absolutely, it did not matter, hierarchy was gone. So whatever, like before you clock in, whatever deference you're showing somebody, the second you clock in, that goes away. You've got to say exactly what you think is true. You've got to be assertive. You've got to be willing to call it. And I was just like, wow, like there are real consequences when people aren't, for whatever reason, compelled to say what they think is true.
And the most beautiful illustration of that is the movie Crimson Tide. Have you ever seen it?
I have, but a long time ago.
Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman, I think.
Yes.
And that's the whole plot of the movie. It's the captain of the boat and his XO, and there's a decision to be made, and the XO is doing everything he can to prevent a bad decision from being made by the captain, who's chosen a particular path to pursue. And the entire movie is about that fact. And at the end, the way that whole thing is shown as being the true value of not just free speech, but honor in that whole system is what happens is they end up not launching nuclear weapons at my boys, as it was a Cold War movie. And it turns out to be the right decision. However, there is a mutiny aboard a nuclear submarine, which is a pretty big fucking deal,
Woof.
right? So there is some kind of investigation, and the captain is questioned about what happened, but his XO is not in this courtroom, the military court martial, whatever it is. And they bring in Denzel Washington, who's the XO, and they say, we've made a decision, something like this. And he goes, what, without my testimony? And they say, Captain Ramsey, who's the captain of the boat, I've known him for 30 years. We don't need to mistrust him, right? And the point is that at the end of that whole process, the captain who fought so hard to have his decision implemented knows he fucked up, and he's willing to admit it. That's the whole point of the movie, right? And it ends by, I think the final shot of the thing is, since then, they've changed the protocol on the submarines so that they've changed the whole thing basically, right? So you no longer have that conflict, which is exactly what you're talking about, right? A situation, someone speaks up, that speech is eventually heard. People cling more to what's important over what is in their own personal interest, right? Because there's a bigger thing at stake, and lessons are learned. That's like the whole thing in a movie. That's why free speech is important, because it prevents you from making mistakes in the future.
You've said that every generation has to fight for free speech again. Why? What is this is my bias. There's some biological thing that makes people want to shut down free speech for whatever reason, and then there's some biological reason why people want it on the other side. Now, I think we've laid out why it can be wildly problematic to not have free speech, but what's the pull on the other side? Why does every generation have to fight this over and over?
Well, free speech is kind of unpleasant, isn't it?
It can be, man. So
no, it is. It is. I mean, when we think
in what way? Because people say things that make you go, "Oh yeah, that was kind of stupid of me,"
or they just say things that you don't like, or they express opinions you don't agree with, right? For example, I feel very strongly about what's happening in Ukraine.
Yep.
Right. So for me, hearing people saying horrible shit about Ukrainians who are fighting for their lives and calling them Nazis and lying about that whole situation, it upsets me, or it could do if I let it. And at some points I let it. It's a fact. What if I could just press a button and then none of these people ever say any of that again? Wouldn't my life be so much more improved? Right?
Definitely not. But that could be because I'm already so far down the path.
Yeah.
So
you understand that my life would not be improved. But a lot of people don't understand that, because it's stimulus reaction. That's all it is. Oh, I feel bad. Okay, shut it down.
Right.
That's how a lot of people feel about life in general, because most people, as you well know, don't go through life not feeling in control. And so when a thing happens that you don't want to experience, that's what happens. That's what it's quite a natural instinct. And so in many ways, I would argue free speech is very unnatural. It's a very unnatural thing, and that's why it has to be fought for repeatedly, because it's always tempting to go to shut it down. I don't want to hear this, and also, if your ego is invested, this is the hardest thing for people who do what you do and do what I do, whether you run a small YouTube channel or a massive business. Everyone has an element of ego that takes ages to get rid of, to process and and so it's a challenge to your ego to have people challenge the things that you are saying or believing or thinking. And it's only when you transcend that and you go, this is about something bigger than me. This is what you said about the speech you give your team, right? You said, if we're going to get to where we want to go, then you have to be able to challenge me. But if all we're trying to do is get to where I want to go, maybe I don't need to hear your crappy opinion about how I'm doing anything wrong. Maybe I just need you to suck up to me so that we carry on doing stuff that makes me feel good.
An owner will never do that. A successful owner will never do that, because they know that at the end of the day, the rubber meets the road. If you get a company, I guess, that's like finally hit escape velocity and it's just making enough money, then you can start being stupid. But this is why the average company now stays in the S&P 500, I think, for 12 years. It used to be 61.
Right.
If you made it to the S&P 500, baby, gravy train, 61 years, now 12.
Yeah.
Bananas. So anyway, there's just a death spiral that happens when you want people to suck up. It's really interesting. So I came to being a CEO through a very weird way. I started as a copywriter, worked my way to partner in one company, then tried to quit that company. And so they made me an equal partner in the next company. Long story, my audience has heard me tell the story 1,000 times. And so that, I was like, I clawed my way to the top in a very emotionally difficult environment. That was the intellectual equivalent of Thunderdome. Like, we actually used to say that. This is not me like making it up. It was like one man or two men enter, one man leaves. Like, we used to talk about that all the time. And so it really was meant in some ways to be that difficult. And so as I looked at it and was like, how much of this works? How much of it doesn't? There were some ideas that were brilliant, like challenge me. Other ideas that were less likely to make it with me when I was on my own. And
like what?
Like, I realized very quickly that I need to give my power away. So my job in getting to the CEO position is not to flex and show everybody how powerful I am. My job at getting to CEO was to empower everybody else so that it could scale. And that is very difficult to do, to claw your way to that role and then be like, hey, actually, for me to get where I want to go, I have to, in some ways, it actually be really interesting. It would take us hours to really explain what running a business is. But in many ways, you're submitting yourself to your employees, and you're saying, I actually don't refer to my employees as my employees. Just psychologically, it's not the right move. So we refer to each other as teammates.
Yeah, that's what I call my
dude, I'm telling you,
team.
The psychological thing that does, I think, is very important. We also give equity to our team, so it's like, hey, you actually really own a piece of this company. So now it's like we're pulling for the same thing. We're teammates. You're not my family. I'm holding you to a standard. I absolutely expect you to perform well. I consider myself to need to be as good as a human could be at my position. So I know what my position is. I am not interested in being a micromanager, but I have to like, hey, how are things going for you? I want to make sure that you have, the way that I refer to myself is I'm the soil. You guys are the things that are going to grow. And so my job is to create the soil here that freedom of speech, challenge authority, all of that stuff is incredibly important to create that kind of vibe so that you can ultimately get the things you want to go. But as that, one, to create that is very difficult because I think, and this is the next thing I want to talk about, that there is part of the reason I think that people have to fight for free speech every generation is that there is innate in humans, partly because of ego, partly because of fear, partly because of insecurity, partly because it's awesome, is a drive for totalitarian style control.
Yeah.
And I've often thought it's really good that I'm not smart enough to lead this company in a dictatorial fashion. Because if I were right, like say 85% of the time, I could probably get away with it. But the reality is that I'm not. And so I never worked with Steve Jobs, so maybe I'm wrong and this is just mythology, but I have a feeling he was just smart enough that he could just like slap people around, be absolutely horrible, tell them what to do, and it still worked. And they built an amazing company. And so very few people were like, he's a lot of fun to work for. So I can't do that. I can't deploy that methodology because if I'm a dick to you, I'm going to be wrong way too frequently, and now I'm just going to hemorrhage human capital. So anyway, I think that's a big part of the pull is that being a dictator feels awesome. Telling
Does it
people,
though? Does it? See, people say that, but look, I've never been inside another human being's skin, obviously, but
it's insecurity provoking. Is that where you're going?
no, why? It just doesn't feel good.
Why not?
Because you're making other people feel bad.
Do you think they see that? Yes. Because some of them, like when I heard stories about Saddam Hussein's son,
Yeah.
yikes.
Yeah. So I suppose there are some psychopaths, and they probably accumulate at the top of Fortune 500 companies. It's weird to me. I've never been, because I fear in myself the instinct to authoritarianism. But when I actually started managing our team, I quickly realized that I actually didn't need to fear that at all, because I'm actually the opposite. I have to force myself to say things that might not be pleasant for them, but that need to be. It's something I have to overcome all the time. I do not enjoy making other people feel bad one bit. And dictatorial.
I won't say that's the only part of being a dictator, though.
It's not.
Because when you run a company, I like knowing I'm the one person that can't be fired. They can all quit, and I think people working at a company underestimate how brutal that is, but they can't fire me. And that feels nice.
Well, yeah. But does that make you a dictator, though?
There's an element of that. I have the quote unquote totalitarian control over my company. People are going to do what I say. And it ultimately, it forces you into a George Washington position where it's like, I could keep this power, but I actually am going to give it away. And in the way that he gave it away because he felt it was the right thing for the country, and it's probably good that he was as old as he was, because he was just like, Jesus Christ, this is a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
And I would really like to retire to my farm now. There is something about that feeling of like, as long as the company is making money and I can't be fired. This is why I don't take money. I don't take outside money, because then you can be fired. The board can fire you. And I would hate that. Anyway, I get your point. It's a mixed bag.
And I suppose the fact is that, as we talked about, people have different psychological profiles. There are some people who are psychopathic, right? We're talking about authoritarianism, though.
Why we always have to fight every generation for free speech.
Well, because it's not natural. That's why. It's not a natural state of being, I think. I don't think that in the ancestral environment, in a tribe of 150 people, there was a huge amount of free speech. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's a quite artificial idea in some ways. That's why it hasn't been around for very long in historical terms. I mean, the idea that freedom of expression matters is sort of a few hundred years old at best, actually, and never really been properly implemented anyway, even in those times. Now, look, the reason we keep banging on about free speech, we should acknowledge this as well, is the technological environment is very different. A word said in private 200 years ago really probably didn't have a huge amount of impact on how people thought and felt and whatever. You say something on Twitter now, it could be seen by hundreds of millions of people and have far-reaching implications. So even though language hasn't changed that much, the impact of language has. And I can see why, I don't believe there's ever going to be a free internet again. There was a gold rush moment of the internet. Do you remember it?
When you say free, you mean uncensored?
Yeah. Yeah. That's not going to happen again. It's just the technology is too powerful. But nobody would allow that.
What do you think about what Elon is doing with Twitter?
What specifically?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the way that I see it is him taking over this thing, making it open source, so people are not open source, but transparent, so everybody can see what the algorithm is, and there's no mystery about who's getting blocked or why.
And that part of it I like. But I think I never met Elon. I actually did Bill Maher's show with him today, but we didn't get a chance to talk. So I don't know what he's like. I've never met him, and I'm just saying this as an outside observer. And I actually think he's a very important figure in the culture and what he's attempting to do in terms of the survival of humanity. Actually, really important. I disagree with him about certain things. But you have to be honest and recognize that Twitter is a benevolent dictatorship, which is much better than the oligarchy we had before. It is better. But I see that there's, any dictatorship is benevolent as long as it's benevolent, right? So, for example, Twitter, I think, is in a bit of a standoff with Substack at the moment, which for someone who writes on Substack, I find it a little bit frustrating.
What's the standoff?
The standoff is that Substack came up with a thing called Substack Notes, which I think the people at Twitter believe is an attempt to compete with Twitter, which I don't think it is, given that Substack, I think, have like 35 million subscriptions versus whatever Twitter has. They're not comparable. But there's been some things that happened on that front that make me think that, I really wish this dictatorship remained benevolent for as long as possible.
Is he throttling Substack people or something? Like if you're trying to link out to it, or?
I don't have access to the actual data to be able to say accurately. There was a period of time, it was quite short, when if you posted a Substack link on Twitter, it would actually, if you clicked it, it would take you to a page saying this link is unsafe.
Interesting.
And if you tweeted a link to Substack, you couldn't like or retweet it. You could only quote tweet it. So it was direct suppression of these things. This happened for a very short period of time. And then we are in the position where we are now, where some people say suppression is going on quietly, and some people say it's not.
Interesting. Well, if he makes a code available, people real fast point out whether that's really happening or not.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. Okay, so free internet was a moment going away. It becomes a very interesting question, getting back to, do we want freedom of speech? How far in Kisin land we're going to go? What we're going to...
I'm so grateful I'm not Elon. I cannot tell you.
Just the pressure or what?
That decision, that specific one decision is like, where's that line? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Because once you go from anyone's allowed to express an opinion, which I genuinely believe, like you and I sitting here without the cameras on, if you want to be racist, I may not stick around, but I believe you have a right to say that, right? What about when that is recorded on camera and it goes out to millions of people? What if I say, as David Icke, this conspiracy guy in the UK, said at the beginning of the pandemic, that COVID is caused by 5G? And then the next day people go out and burn down 5G masts, right? I was abhorred. I found the decision to, that's probably not even a word, I found the decision to ban Trump from Twitter abhorrent.
Yeah.
But I can also, if I'm being intellectually honest, I opposed it completely, and I said it at the time. I can find it in my mind a situation in which a leader of a democratic country, in my opinion, should be banned from the public square.
Really?
Yeah.
Give me an example.
Well, it's obvious if they're inciting large-scale mass violence, for example. They're saying, what we need to do is go out and shoot these people, right? Now,
I don't think Putin tweets, but would you boot him if he did? Because there is a guy, oh God, I follow him, I forget his name, on the Russian side, because I was like, oh my God, like he's tweeting what he really thinks about the West. This is crazy. Yes.
Yeah, he drinks a lot.
And I was like, whoa, like this guy's just not pulling any punches.
Yeah.
Like these idiots and all this. I was like, wow, like, okay.
This is why I'm saying I'm grateful not to be in the position where I have to make these decisions, because I think at the end of the day...
Because there's no right answer.
There's no right answer. Now,
Interesting.
we're all fighting over where that line is. And my argument is that line has been pushed way in against free speech. I think that's Elon's point, and that's why he's taken over Twitter, and that's why he's rolling that line back. But inevitably, there will always be a point where you go, okay, that's far enough, I think.
Yeah.
Because the technology is too powerful now. The impact of words is can be so catastrophic.
Yeah.
But then again, I can see counter arguments to my own argument. I mean, think about, what about the Civil War in America? A bunch of people saying, we must end slavery, and if people want to fight us over that, we got to go out and fight. What if that happened today? What if people went out and said, we got to fight whatever, and that means we need to pick up our weapons and go to the streets? Do you interfere with that as the owner of Twitter?
Man, so
right?
Can I throw some really bad ideas that I'm thinking through this. I've not had to articulate this stuff to myself or to anybody else. But so here's where I come down on this. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. So says Thomas Sowell. I think that is so important for people to understand that whatever solution people think they have, it is always going to create some kind of problem.
Right.
And so there isn't utopia, there isn't perfection. So knowing that, I would say that there really do have to be some things that you think are worth dying for. Remember, I am thinking through this right now. So I would die for my wife.
Mm-hmm.
I hope it never comes to that.
Mm-hmm.
I am inspired by people that would die for their country or whatever. I'd have to really think about, like, I am very glad that, like, I am not at a conscriptable age at this point. That doesn't break my heart.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly love America. I will actively thank people that fought for America. I will thank them for their service. I have a tremendous sense of gratitude for people that have died for this country and died for its ideals. Like, it just, whoa, like that really hits me at a deep emotional level. And I know it's become like uncool at this point. Like, I remember somebody told me they put an American flag up in front of their house. I was like, oh, someone's going to rip that down. And they did. And when I said it, I was like, fuck, that's really heartbreaking. Anyway, so you need to have things you would die for. And that means, to me, this is me, that there are some ideas that you do your best to predict the outcome of having those implemented. And you say, that idea is so strong for the value system that I hold that I'd be willing to die for it. I grew up in the milieu of the West and America and our Constitution and the First Amendment. And so for me, like, free speech, it's one of those things, man, where it's like, God, I really hope that it doesn't come to me having to die for it. And I really hope that it isn't me that the mob turns on. Like, trust me, I'm insecure about that, and I don't want to come across with like bluster or who the fuck cares. I really care. Like, I see how. Oh yeah.
Why do you care?
Okay, so
sorry, I hope you don't mind me asking.
I love it. I think in fractals. I try to stop myself from doing it, but you're introducing a fractal that I love. So here's why I care. I have worked face to face with the reality that the number one predictor of your future success is your zip code. That has become an animating factor in my life because people that I loved were devoured by the bad ideas that were passed on to them by their zip code. And I've looked closely enough at the problem that I realize it is ideas. And if you look at Jeffrey Canada and what he's done with his charter schools and stuff, where he takes the same kids in the same school, literally the same building, doesn't choose them based on merit. It's completely randomized based on the same kids that go to that school, and they end up having like 5 times the graduation rates and better scores. It's fucking crazy. So I'm very confident that this is an ideas problem. Because I believe that this is an ideas problem, I have tried to come up with a solution. My solution is the company impact theory. The reason it's called impact theory is because my theory on how to impact people at scale is by getting across a growth mindset, which I really believe is all you need, at scale through ideas and entertainment. This show is my way of impacting the 2%, and then the video game I'm making is my way of impacting the 98%. And buried in this video game are just growth mindset ideas. I'm not trying to make vegetables taste good. I think we make a fun game, but it happens, like, if a mentor gives you advice in our game, it'll be real advice. So it's like, okay, that's what I'm trying to build. And I worry that I will taint my own brand because we just live in a divisive moment. And so I have often thought, do I do more good by receding into the background and nobody knows who the hell I am? Nobody has to think about what I like and believe and all that, and they can just interact with my characters. Or do I step out front? Now, the realities of my business, because it is so hard and so expensive to build that side of the business, that I have to do this side of the business, which makes us just a metric ton of money. So we have that whole side. And so the second part of this, the reason that I'm in conflict, is that I feel a moral obligation to 2 things: not be a coward, which I started to feel like a coward at the beginning of the pandemic, and I realized I believe things that I'm not saying out loud, so I'm effectively in the Soviet Union. And then 2, I really need to do everything I can to help people that the ideas would benefit. And so I had ideas that I thought would be useful to people. I had access to people that had even better ideas than I'll ever have that could help people. And by not reaching out to those people and asking those questions, it made me feel like a coward. So I was like, okay, I have to start speaking on this. And that's why.
That makes sense. That makes sense. But I suppose the reason I asked is I was just wondering why someone in your position, where you have FU money and a huge audience and a network of people that I imagine most of would stick by you if you expressed your very reasonable opinions, why you would be concerned about doing any of that.
Because the reality is that I am very aware that I would not do well pandering to an audience. And so if I say something that lights the world on fire, I'm still going to live in a world of nuance. And that will be very rough. I would, at that point, you have to pick the side that doesn't hate you if you want to keep making a lot of money. And
really?
Yeah. You don't agree with that?
I don't know. I mean, I deliberately piss parts of my audience off all the time because I don't, a lot of people come to our show because we debate controversial ideas or discuss controversial ideas. We get people from extremes coming in. And I'm quite clear about where the demarcation lines are for me because I don't want to end up in a position where it's like, I think I've got a YouTube channel with Francis that's got, 10 million subscribers and it actually only has like 100,000 loyal ones. I'd rather know now. Do you see what I mean?
Yep.
So, but I also happen to believe that there are millions and millions and millions of people out there who like and would enjoy and truly get what we do in a way that means that they would continue to support us even if we said some things that a lot of people out there didn't like, but if they were coming from the right place. But again, is that a true belief or is that just is that wishful thinking? I don't know. You're in a much better position to tell me.
Well, it's interesting. So I don't know if I'm in a better position to tell you on that because I haven't run this experiment, but I have had these conversations with my team who are, so to your point, every word that I say on this show, I believe, but I am far more aggressive off camera than I am on camera. I'm far more flippant and lean towards making something funny or whatever. And so my team loves that. And they have been desperate, like to record that side of me where it's just like, completely unleashed. And like we were having what I thought was a fucking hilarious conversation yesterday about raising AI children, which I actually think is going to be real.
Yeah.
And my team was very much like, yeah, this would be the kind of stuff like we want to hear you go ham like this on camera. And I'm like, my wife and I do relationship content, and off camera, when I say, so I used to be a stand-up comic. I don't know if you've ever heard that side of me. So I know you did as well. Until very recently, I guess you've sort of pressed pause on that.
Or probably 2 or 3 years ago now. So
okay.
It feels like
so you were like a for real stand-up comic. I was a wannabe stand-up comic in my teens and early 20s. And my whole shtick was I would talk about the most outlandish shit. The stuff where you're like, I can't believe, what the fuck? Nobody talks about that. And so that's like, I have that natural part of my personality, but I'm trying to be the next Walt Disney. I'm not trying to be the next Tony Robbins or the next Joe Rogan. I'm trying to be the next Walt Disney. And I was like, going to the relationship content, people always want to ask us about sex. Now in my real life, I'll make your eyelids curl back. Like I have no problem talking about it. Doesn't faze me at all. But I can't escape this question. Do people want footage of Walt Disney talking about his sex life? And I'm like, I don't know that I want that. And so my love, man, and I really love it. And it's silly and childish, but you'll notice I have a cartoon character on my shirt. And this is a character I thought of. And there's nothing that gets me more excited than, like, I've written comic books. And when somebody writes in and is like, dude, that comic, like I loved it so much. It really like impacted me. This idea was so cool and so entertaining. That I almost wish it didn't. That impacts me more than the person who's like, oh my God, that episode you did, or if I do solo content, they're like, oh man, I'm using that idea and I've taught it to my kids. And that stuff is meaningful to me. But my just first love and passion is storytelling. And so I am very conflicted about like how ham to go on thinking through all of these ideas live on camera, but I find myself just inching and inching and inching that way. So anyway, to the initial point, the initial question about does this become problematic in any way to deal with these topics or bring this to the forefront? I don't know, maybe it does, given what I'm trying to accomplish. It is a little bit sticky.
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want. All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today.
That's very interesting to me. It's an interesting conversation, which I think a lot of people who are making things in the online space, who are by virtue of what they do in the public eye to some extent, have to think about. It's interesting you mentioned about the cartoon character, because it sounds like to me the reason that praise of that lands with you in a different way is that it's the most quintessentially authentic expression of your true being.
It's interesting. Not quite true.
Okay.
So the most authentic expression of my true being will come out in multiple ways. So the thing that I love being on stage talking about mindset and business. Like if you get me going on either of those, dude, because this is where I'm like, I almost feel like I can't talk fast enough because I know these ideas will change anybody's life. They are timeless ideas. I'm just like, this is so cheesy, but I'm just the vessel right now that happens to know how to package these ideas in a way that people will find useful. But dude, I took myself from scrounging in my couch cushions to find enough change to put gas in my car, true story, to selling a company for $1 billion that I built with my partners from absolute fucking scratch. We did not raise money. And so I'm like, okay, the only reason I was able to do this is because of a set of ideas. I can teach this to you. I've now built 3 companies in a row in 3 totally divergent areas. All of them have been multi-million-dollar companies. One of them was a $1 billion company. So it's like, oh my God, like take notes, get a pen out. So I love doing that. But the act of being on stage is not as emotionally captivating as losing myself inside of a story.
Interesting.
And so whatever weird twist of brain fate, I am a hyper responder to stories, movies, TV shows, cartoons, video games, hyper responder. And so I would have been like in days of old, I would not have been a good warrior. I don't have the physicality for that. I would have been the storyteller for sure. I would have been the one around the campfire that built the mythology and just really understood the deep psychological impact of story, and just I get the chills from hearing stories and telling stories. And so there's a secondary layer that I don't fully even understand in myself that makes me love the story side.
That makes sense.
Okay, so I want to get back to the central idea of if you were, in fact, this is the right way to ask it. You have a child, you have a son, you want him to grow into a good world. Your Oxford speech was really reaching across to people that believe in ideology that you think will lead them somewhere that isn't helpful to them or to society. So while I understand you don't want to be Elon Musk and you don't want to be making some of these decisions, give me the broad strokes of what you think makes for a good society.
Well, this is the point that I was going to make a lot earlier when you were talking about how you know what works. And this is one of the difficulties that we find ourselves in, because the moment I start saying to you, here are the things that work, I know you can hear them, but a lot of people out there don't hear them in the way that they're intended, which is you say growth mindset, right? If you want these results, this is what you do. Right? For society, that's A, much more difficult, and B, one of the problems that you end up having is it necessitates the making of generalized statements about people and humanity and society. These things are generally speaking good. And we are now in a position where the moment I say that, for example, you and I, before we started, we talked about most people should have children. Something, it was maybe phrased, I can't remember if you used the word should or it's a quote. And I agree with that. But the moment you say that, particularly if you say it online, a lot of people are going to come along and give you some very legitimate examples of people in situations in which that isn't true. And one of the big challenges that we face is it's impossible to make any sort of generalized normative statement because those counterexamples will immediately be used against you, and usually in a weaponized way. So, for example, one of the themes of today, it seems to me, are mutual, shared love, not mutual, but shared love of Thomas Sowell. One of the key messages that he expressed, and it was then communicated by other people who picked up on it, particularly from the black community, was the idea of the importance of what we used to call an intact family. Parents living together under one roof with their children. People have different explanations of why that is no longer the case nearly as much as it used to be. Some people say it's a consequence of the sexual revolution. Some people will say it's a consequence. Thomas Sowell himself, I think, would say that it's a consequence of the welfare state. You can slice that 100 different ways, or maybe not 100, but a few. But if you say one of the good things that will make society better is children growing up in a two-parent household, most often with a man and a woman, which allows them to learn the stereotypes and the ways of behaving and blah, 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 blah. Well, you've immediately excluded, and this is the worst thing you can do in modern society, you have excluded a whole lot of people who also have value and dignity and so on and so forth. So that is why we're in the predicament that we're in. And I, as someone, you ask exactly the right question. I struggle to answer it, actually, because it's very, very difficult to talk about some of these things without immediately finding yourself in a position where you're being attacked by people on what actually seem like pretty reasonable grounds. Why are you sitting there, Konstantin, telling other people to have or not have children? Why are you sitting there demonizing single mothers? Why are you sitting there, saying that this type of family unit is better than that type of family unit, when we're all unique, special individuals who have the right to blah, 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 blah. So it's difficult. And, this
Do you think there's an answer to that question, though?
To which question?
What you just asked. Why are you doing this? Like, if somebody asked me that question.
Yeah. Well, my answer to that is, I believe that, for example, if we talk about family unit, children, it's not that I believe, there's an inescapable avalanche of evidence which shows that children growing up outside of that environment do infinitely worse on average. Now, it's on average. There are single mothers or single fathers who bring up their children wonderfully. There are children who grow up in care, who go on to have incredible lives of fulfillment and success. There are all sorts of counterexamples. But on average, a child growing up in a stable family environment is far more likely to do better at school, to avoid going to prison, and all sorts of other things, right? So that's the reason, if you don't want children to suffer and if you want to have a cohesive society, that is why I would make that statement, right?
It feels to me like you could append. Look, I know that reality is going to slap me in the mouth because I'm about to say this and I'm going to read the comments. People are going to be like, he's a fucking moron. So, but I will say that seems super reasonable to me. So I'm the biology guy. So I'm like, oh, this is about first principles. This is about data. And if you just append one thing, we're gonna run the experiment because you just laid out your argument. And I'm just gonna append one thing, and we're gonna see if people are like, "Word, these guys finally cracked it." If you are outside of that, you're a gay couple, you're a single mother, single father, whatever. You still have dignity, and I'm so excited for you that you have children, and you might be in a position where there are things you're gonna have to take into consideration that you just have to deal with. Right? So if I'm riding in a car versus driving a motorcycle, I'm going to act differently. They're both going to get me to my destination. And if I'm careful, they're safe. I will get people there safely. Maybe one has like a track record. Cars are a little bit safer, or maybe even a lot safer than motorcycles. But what I need to know is if I'm on the motorcycle, I want you to tell me what the risks are because I'm on the motorcycle. So now I need to act a little bit differently. Maybe there are things that I need to do, maybe even as the traditional couple, maybe there are blind spots that we have and you can help me understand what those are. I'm not saying these are morally better. I'm just saying the data shows that there are outcomes that are better. And so this is what I'm always trying to get people to understand in business. You have to know the metric of success. So, hey, everybody, having kids, gay, straight, single, wherever, doesn't matter. What's the outcome that you want? You want your kids to do well economically, emotionally, all of the above, whatever. Okay, cool. Now let's just look at the data. What choices are most likely to get you there? If you can't make that choice either because you love somebody else that doesn't fit that mold, or you lost your significant other, whatever. There's a million reasons where you find yourself in one of the ones that's maybe a higher risk group. That doesn't make you bad, but you don't want to be blind to those risks. You, I would hope, want somebody to tell you, okay, hey, you have certain things you're going to need to address and really be thoughtful of. So for instance, this all started from, before we started rolling, I said most people should have kids. I am not having kids. And so the reason that I brought it up was I know that I'm playing what I consider a high risk game. I think it's emotionally high risk because evolution has said, hey, I'm going to make having children hyper rewarding to make sure that you do it. And so much of our circuitry is around the expectation from an evolutionary perspective that you will have a child. So if you don't, there can be a lot of loneliness, a sense of not having meaning and purpose, nothing is living beyond you. And so, did I waste my life? And all of those questions come with a really tidy answer if you have kids. Now, it's not to say that raising kids isn't brutally difficult, and I understand that. And that's why I don't say everybody should. I'm just saying, like, nature has made that one maybe a little bit easier to find fulfillment than the not having. So my wife and I talk a lot about how do we protect ourselves from that? Because I think when we're 80 and running a business isn't cool anymore, and we're not caught up in what we're building, and maybe I just never managed to build the next Disney, and so I feel now like a failure, and I never pulled it off, and so now I'm really struggling. So I'm like, we need to be thoughtful about that now so that we know how to frame our life, think about our life, all of that when we're older, so that this doesn't become an emotionally devastating choice we made. We need to do it with our eyes wide open, et cetera. So that feels like the very, I would say, wise argument that you've made, that the data shows they're higher risk here or there. If you add the caveat to, this isn't a moral thing. This isn't me saying that you're not worthy of love or whatever, but so often people want to be right, that they maybe aren't a good messenger for that.
I think that's certainly true, and it's a rebuke that I willingly accept. I don't always phrase things in the best way that I could sometimes. However, you're operating at a level of detachment from emotion that most people are not. And one of the problems that all people face really is that we all, or certainly most people, I think your circumstances are quite different to the average person. I think we both agree, right? Most people are operating at a level of unhappiness with their choices or things that they experience without maybe realizing that the consequences of the choices. That makes it very difficult for them to accept data. Because if the data says you fucked up, it's quite uncomfortable. And there's nothing you can do, right? So, for example, I mentioned something about the way that women in modern society on Twitter, I don't know if you saw this, have... What I was trying to get across is essentially women don't actually have the true freedom to make a choice because there are...
About having a kid?
Yes, because there are cultural...
Tell me more.
Because there are cultural settings that say some paths for women are better than others. So if you are a housewife, that is not as high status as having a high-powered career.
Very traumatic in my eyes, but yes.
Very...
It's devastating that that's become sort of this low status thing.
Completely. And it isn't the fault of women, by the way, although it is often other women that will react that way, but it's also the fault of men too. Like we're both sexes are complicit in this. But if you are a 44-year-old woman who maybe you feel I don't know if it's objectively true necessarily, but let's say you feel subjectively that you did your best. You went out and you dated guys and you did your best to work on the relationship, but they were assholes, or this happened or that happened, or one of them got killed by a car or whatever. And here you are, you're 44 years old, you haven't had a child, and here's some dickhead on the internet telling you to have children when you're not going to have them, right? that level of detachment that you have, which is to go, well, we're not having children. Here are the consequences. Here are some of the actions I can take to mitigate that. That is not that that's not something that a lot of people have. And that's why the conversation becomes very, very difficult, because there's a lot of emotional attachment to what people are saying, and there are probably things that I'm like that about. You tell me this or that, and I might react emotionally. I know that is not effective, and so I work on it over time, and I've certainly got a lot better. But I think a lot of people are not in that position that you're talking about, where they're truly conscious of the choices that they're making and their true consequences. So that's one of the reasons it makes all of these conversations very difficult. And Jordan Peterson is working on something called the ARC, I think, and there are other people who are talking about what is our positive vision.
What's the ARC?
I think I haven't looked too deeply into it. I'll probably end up being involved in it in some way, but it's essentially what I've been talking about for some time, which is what is that positive vision? And the reason, I'll be honest with you, I am, first of all, I'm not smart enough to come up with the whole thing on my own. And also, I'm also kind of a little bit not brave enough, too, to come up with the whole thing on my own, because the amount of shit you're going to take for starting to articulate some of these things.
Oh, my God.
Right?
I don't want Jordan Peterson's life. That looks really brutal.
No, it's terrible. So I don't want to be the only one saying it, which is why I think we're a group of people to be talking about it. And that's why I'm super excited, particularly on the children's stuff with people like Louise Perry and Mary Harrington.
Louise Perry, I feel like I've heard that name.
She wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, I think. That's one of her
yes.
books.
I think Jordan interviewed her, right?
Yeah, and we've interviewed her on TRIGGERnometry.
Oh, word.
So her and Mary Harrington are these two feminists, but of a very particular kind. Mary's book's called Feminism Against Progress.
Yes. I think I listened to your interview on that.
Yeah. I think you'd have a wonderful conversation with both of them.
I'm too chicken. It's like, what do you want the channel to be about?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Louise, particularly, Mary's very intellectual, almost to the detriment of sometimes getting her message across. She's a wonderful human being, and her ideas are fascinating. But Louise, for me, I sing her praises everywhere, because to me, she's like a female Jordan Peterson. And she can get away with a lot more because of that. But fundamentally, one of the things we're going to have to reckon with is as a society, or as a civilization even, we've unpicked a lot of the threads of the sweater that used to hold the sweater together. Religion, family, children, all of these things. And we are going to have to think about what a new sweater looks like. And it has to be, I feel, I explained to you why there's good reason to be cowardly about saying a lot of these things, which is why we have to frame it in a different way that is invitational. It can't be, you must have children. That doesn't work anymore. Maybe it never worked. I mean, maybe it did work. 100 years ago, maybe it did work for most people most of the time. It has to be more like what you are talking about, which is, what do you want? What do you truly, truly want? Because, let's be honest, going out to parties and getting drunk and taking drugs and having casual sex isn't making you fulfilled. I'm sorry if this sounds like a conservative idea. I'm sorry. I wish I didn't have to articulate these ideas that sound conservative, because then people call me conservative and then I end up in the box. But the fact of the matter is, we all know that is a fact. These things do not make you fulfilled and happy in the long run. They just don't, right? So what is it that you want? What is it that every human being wants? You talked about it. I can't remember if it was before we started or after. It's meaning and fulfillment, right? How are you going to get there? Here are some things that people have done in the past to get those things. Meaning and fulfillment. How do you get that? Well, for some people, that's going to be meaningful work, right? But not everybody's going to have that opportunity. For some people, it's going to be a family. Not everyone's going to have that opportunity. But here is a menu with a few options that we can offer you as a human, as the body of human knowledge about these things. That's what I think it has to look like. It has to look like. And look, if you don't want to sign up to this, that's fine. But deep down, everybody wants meaning and fulfillment. Here are some of the ways to get there.
Man, I think that is critical. Meaning and fulfillment really is the punchline. I am often trying to get people to understand all that ultimately matters is how you feel about yourself when you're by yourself. And the way that you feel good about yourself is basically following the guidelines of fulfillment, which I think there's a recipe for. And it goes something like this. Again, evolution guy over here. So evolution is going to guarantee that if you do the following things, you will be fulfilled. And if you don't, you won't, no matter what, don't care how rich you are. You're going to have to work really hard to gain a set of skills that allow you to serve yourself and others in a way that you find exciting. If you do that, your life will be awesome. If it comes easily to you, you won't have the things you want. If you work really hard but only serve yourself, you won't have the things you want. Like nature is trying to make sure that you have kids that stay alive long enough to have kids that have kids. So it's like that's the drill. And that is, as far as I can tell, that's the formula that's going to make you feel that way. So in the working hard and all that is where you earn your own respect. Earning your own respect is about having a value system. You say, these are the things that are worthy of respect, and I'm going to do these. I think the only feedback loop is the pursuit of fulfillment. So anyway, if you're doing things to earn your own respect, then I think you'll feel good about yourself when you're by yourself, even if you're failing. I've got a whole shtick about how to construct your mindset to be resilient, et cetera, beyond what we're talking about right now.
Where does raising children, particularly if you're a woman, fit into that?
Okay, so...
And family generally.
So this is where if you think about what I'm trying to do is the grand scale version of what having a family is. And I think if the individual is the right level of analysis for your own life, for the government to think about its constituency, all of that is to get down to the individual. The family is the smallest cluster of meaning. And so if nature wants to make sure that you contribute to the group, the family becomes the place where you can first express that, but it's also the place where you get to be, you have a role. And so you're going to be able to have autonomy. So there's a lot of things, if you've read Steven Pinker's book, Drive, talks a lot about this. Daniel Pink? I forget which one of them wrote this, forgive me. But there's a book called Drive.
I think it's Steven Pinker.
There's a book called Drive. You're right. It's definitely not. Daniel Pink, maybe. The book is Drive. Anyway, and in it talks about what really drives people. A huge driver, other than meaning and purpose, is autonomy. And so at the family level, there's a reason that people say, I'm the king of the castle, meaning of my own home. Like when I come in my own home, nobody else gets to tell me what to do, et cetera, et cetera. And so the husband and the wife come together as this yin-yang duel that together is truly better than either of them are individually. If you take a long-term stance, you're going to shape each other. So you're literally making each other better 100%. When it's functioning well. And then when you have kids, now you've got that. I have done the thing. I have worked hard to become a worthy wife or a worthy husband, a worthy mom, a worthy father. So worked hard, gained a set of skills, and now I'm serving the group, not just myself. So I'm doing things that matter to me. So I'm going to teach my son to be a man in a way that feels good. And this is the way I believe things ought to be. And so in doing that in that small atom, now it's like you're going to get all that fulfillment that you want. Now I get it. This is probably somewhat of a modern construct, even if you give me modern in the last 20,000 years, right? But I think it's all an echo of things that work at the tribal level, things that work at like the state level, all of it is you get these. The individual has to be strong unto themselves, accomplished, that's probably a dangerous word to use, but strong and accomplished in the ways that they will need to be to serve the family, need to be to serve their local community, and then it just scales up from there. So we do have that drive to, we're really going to derail now, but we want to be recognized for our contributions. And so my wife and I do that for each other. We want to have something that lasts beyond us, kids. So anyway, again, I would like to restate, I don't have children. So it's not the path that I've chosen to walk. But when I look at from an evolutionary standpoint, I'm like, that is the safer path. So anyway, it goes back to there's no solution. There's only trade-offs. And I just want people to understand, okay, whatever path I walk, it's going to be a trade-off. So what am I trading off?
That's right. And I think that's the question that's why I said what I said on Twitter about women not having true choice. I didn't quite phrase it that way, but that's what I meant, which is a lot of people are being culturally manipulated into making decisions that are not in their long-term benefit or interest or happiness. They're just not. They're just not. And they're being encouraged to see the pursuit of meaningless things as far superior to the things that will actually give them meaning and fulfillment on average. Doesn't mean there aren't exceptions, right? But on average. So that, I think, is, and those things, find a partner who loves you, that you love, that you grow together with. Have children if that's what you want to do. Seek meaningful work. And, to me, I'm speaking just from personal experience, personal growth and experience, experiencing myself develop is probably one of the highest values that I hold for myself.
Guaranteed.
Skill acquisition. I always talk to my guys about this. It's like, you don't really want to learn how to do a job necessarily. You want to acquire a set of skills and build a set of skills that can be used to do many different jobs. And you package them together. This is why, like, I know you tried your hand at stand-up, and I did stand-up for probably 4 or 5 years. I never got to the point, it takes about 10 years to become a great stand-up. I never got to the point where I was great. I was doing well. I was pretty good. But what happened was I found something that combined my skills in a better way, which is thinking and talking and joking, and you put that in a package, and then you've got something that's much more interesting than just, for me at least, as a stand-up comedian. I never found that as fulfilling as what I do now. So meaningful work, learn, grow, etc. And then I think, another layer to add on top of this, and this is actually something that I'm aware of thanks to my wife, men and women are incredibly different. Incredibly different. And so you
can't imagine how surprised I was to find that become controversial. I was like, what? Of all the things, I was like, wait, what?
I don't know what to say about that, man. I mean, it's so silly that we even have to have this conversation. But men and women are incredibly different. And one of the most beneficial things to my wife and I's relationship has been the fact that we've read books about how exactly different we are. I mean, John Gray, who I think lives somewhere around here, who's been writing about this for decades now. I don't know if I subscribe to every tenet of his ideology or whatever, but his books work. And some of the things that I've learned from that meant that we have a much more fulfilled and happier relationship, but also we're much more fulfilled and happy as individuals. So it's that know thyself thing, I think. And part of the problem with what I see is we're deliberately brainwashing people not to realize that they are, to a large extent, what they are. That part of who you are is driven by your biology. And if you can understand how best to manage that, particularly in partnership with someone of the opposite sex, if you are heterosexual, you're gonna be like a rocket that's taking off, because you've got all of those things. You know your trigger points, you know the things that don't work for you, you know what works for you. Just like, I don't know if you're familiar with John Gray's work, but like the idea of the cave for a man. Basically, it's the idea that every now and again, a man will pull back in a relationship and will feel like he'll go and work, try and repair his motorcycle or play computer games or read a book, and he'll close the door to the office and not be available. And women tend to find that very scary, because they're like, whoa, what the hell's going on? But the guy is just doing his recharge so that he can come back and be full of love again. Like, that was revolutionary. Because what women will do, if they don't know that, is chase after you into the cave, which means you only run away further. And right. It's this dynamic. And John Gray wrote about this in Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus like 40 years ago. And now we've got all these crazy people running around saying, oh, there's no difference between men and women. I mean, it's insane.
The one that helped me the most, it's like one of those catchy phrases, and I'm like, oh my God, this is so true, is women need to feel loved to have sex.
Yes.
And men need to have sex to feel loved.
That's right.
When I heard that, I was like, oh my God. Like, it was like such an epiphany where, oh, now I get why she acts the way that she does. And now I actually understand myself better, because I never really thought about it. But I was like, yeah, if we're not having sex, I feel disconnected.
Yes.
Whereas for her, if she feels disconnected, she doesn't want to have sex. So now you can get into this really weird dynamic where it's like she wants, all this talk and like connection. And I'm like, man, like I'm not into that unless we're having sex. Like, what are we even talking about here?
And here again, we come back to the problems with the society that we live in. If you've got that issue going on, which every couple has had, the solution is difficult to articulate out loud because it's very controversial, potentially. I mean, John Gray's solution, I don't want to misrepresent it, but it's kind of like sometimes you need to have sex even though you're not entirely... Do you see what...
Oh, I'm waiting for you to say it.
Oh, and it's like, do you see what I mean? Now,
I do.
I am not advocating that anyone has sex that for fuck's sake, I don't want to do this, but you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you're saying.
So in order for men and women to be healthy together, it requires us to be able to say some things that we don't want to say in public.
Yeah.
And that's a bad place to be, that we feel hesitant to say them in public, right? That's a bad place to be if we want men and women to be healthier. And that's another of the things that really bugs me about the situation that we're in, is like the idea that men and women are engaged in some sort of battle of the sexes is the craziest idea I've ever fucking heard. These two groups of people who have spent the entirety of human evolution having to work together to survive and to thrive, they're against each other? Are you crazy? Are you insane? And the very notion that we spend almost no time talking about how the sexes can and should live together and coexist and grow together and so on, and we spend all our time talking about who gets paid more and all of this stuff. I'm not saying those things aren't necessarily important, and I'm against discrimination of any kind, obviously. But the focus of our attention, to me, is on that issue completely in the wrong place.
Yeah, it's interesting. All of this stuff, going back to that idea, there's a reason that these arguments endure, and the reason is that there's truth on both sides.
Yes.
So I read a lot about history. This is something that came to me pretty recently, like the last 5 or 6 years. And you read historical stuff and you realize men and women were working together to survive. It was very harsh. But also, like, people weren't really trying to understand each other as deeply as we might care about that now. And so there very much was like, you went off to war and you did your thing and you really may do some raping and pillaging, and then you come back, but it's like, you're still my husband. And so all of the stuff of we would never have survived without helping each other. And, oh, by the way, people really did rape and pillage. It's like, both of those things are true. And history is messy. And one thing I want to talk about today, but maybe not yet, is what I call the triangle of evil. Humans are complicated, like really complicated. And I like the idea that there are certain mind viruses that as a society make us on the long arc of history bend towards justice. I love that. Like that's amazing. But any one lifetime can have its like horrible things happened in that society, things that we would never be okay with today. I mean, just like really grueling. But at the same time, you can go back to any time in history and there would be love, and you'd be, even if you were an arranged marriage, that you would find this mutual respect and you'd raise kids that you love and you die for each other. I mean, it's just like humans are messy and complicated and beautiful and wonderful. And it's really, really interesting, but you have to be willing to get into the nuance. And so when I think about, you know, living in a modern time, I've been with my wife for 22 years, and in no uncertain terms, I am a better person because of her. I don't know who I would be without her. There was a time before she stepped out front. So she was a housewife and just really supporting me, but I was starting to take off as an entrepreneur, starting to get recognized, had a show, like all of that. And I burst into tears one day, and I'm not a crier, man. So for people like that really, really know me, they know that this is like weird. I burst into tears one day privately, just with my wife. And I was like, you will never get credit for the fact of who I've become because you have influenced me. And even having that conversation, like I love talking about, there's a reason the cliche of behind every powerful man is a powerful woman, because women for eons, not necessarily true now with the pill and the sexual revolution and all that, and they're in the workforce, but for millennia, they had to work through men. And so they got very good at, I want a thing and I'm going to get you to also want that thing.
Are you saying women are manipulative?
Oh, brother, I'm saying like if we can use a word that is less radioactive, but 100%. So in the movie,
Sorry, I'm just
no, I
trolling.
love it. It's just true. It's true. So going back to this idea of being a predictive engine,
Right.
If the more you can predict the outcome of your behaviors,
Right.
the closer you're getting to ground truth.
Right.
And so from an evolutionary perspective, and look, this has changed now and it's awesome. Like I want women to work. My wife is a boss bitch and is an entrepreneur in her own right and is unbelievable. But my wife will be the first to tell you, oh yeah, for the first decade of our marriage, she wasn't expressing herself in business. She was expressing herself through me in business. And it worked, and she knew how to get what she wanted. And it was women, from an evolutionary perspective, they needed to be optimized to tend to young. And so they have effectively superpowers for raising kids. Doesn't mean they need to raise kids. You can allocate those superpowers however you want. But that nature was just like, hey, I need you to be very good at raising children. 15% of women have a fourth photoreceptor that actually lets them see colors that guys can't even see, which hypothesis goes would help them see changes in color in their kids' skin tone so that they'd be able to read sickness, mood, whatever. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Their breasts can produce milk. I mean, just all kinds of things. Their hips for childbirth, on and on and on. And so understanding that for millennia, women were, I mean, we are a sexually dimorphic species, not massively. We're not like gorillas where they're, 8 times bigger than the female, but there is sexual dimorphism. Men have stronger upper bodies, et cetera, et cetera. So the workloads would tend to get broken up in a certain way. And so if you're not going to be the half of the species that's going to confront something head on, like for a woman, and unfortunately I've seen these YouTube videos where when you see a guy snap and throw a punch on a woman and you recognize the difference in ability to generate force, it's distressing. And you realize at the ends of the spectrum, because there's a ton of overlap, so of course there's a lot of women that could beat up a lot of men. But as you get to the ends of the distribution, the strongest man is going to be able to beat up every single woman on the planet, period, bar none, end of story. And so it would not be a good evolutionary strategy for women to do the confrontation head on. So they get far more ingenious. Like they just have a sophisticated set of tools that happen to be psychological in nature. That was a lot of words to get around the word manipulation, but you get the idea. So I was rocked to tears to be like, whoa, you've shaped me into a person that you will never get credit for. Thankfully now, with everything that's happened, I think she does get a lot of credit and she's able to tell her own story and all of that. But it was really a breathtaking moment for me to realize, whoa, like you have shaped me. I have shaped you. We are a partnership. We bring equal value, but in different ways. And the more we've come to understand the different things that we're good at, and each of us are good at different things, but together we really do bring equal weight, but they're not the same thing. Like we're not competing on the same things.
You know what? It's so interesting to me that you told that story because my wife and I are exactly the same. Been together 20 years.
I didn't know you guys have been together so long.
Yeah, been together that long, and it was exactly the same story. My wife was always working from the beginning, but she was also working on me from the beginning, and pretty damn hard, actually. And I forgot to give you a copy of my book. I'll give you one afterwards. But,
I have read it.
I know, but I want to give you a signed copy. And if you've read it,
that.
you know that the dedication in it says to Alina, without whom nothing would be possible and everything would be pointless. And that's how I feel. And more generally, women are incredible. To a man, a woman is fucking amazing because she can do things that you like. I remember the first time I saw my mum resolve a conflict just with a smile and a joke. I was like, wow. I couldn't believe it because it was so different to the way that young men in particular tend to do things. And I was like, whoa, this is incredible. And so that's one of the terrible things about the standoffs that we create. It's like you can learn so much and grow so much together and help each other so much that, this division is completely unnecessary. It should be the other way around. We should be looking for ways to work together and That's why I've always found personal development and relationship growth together to be like essential parts of life. Essential parts of life. So I hear exactly what you're saying. Now, as for the recognition, I mean, do you I believe that partly by talking about it, my wife does get the credit. By dedicating my book to her in that way, from people who read the book, she gets the credit. And also now, I'd like to think, after all the hard work that she put in, the investment is starting to slowly pay off. And as we know from Jordan Peterson, women make 80% of the purchasing decisions. So all that bacon that I'm going to be bringing home, she's going to be enjoying the fruits of that, and so are our children. And that's kind of how it should be, at least for us. She's a very talented photographer in her own right, but it's not something that she's ever made into a huge business. And I'm sure she'll carry on doing it. But right now, she just wants to be with our son. And I could not be happier to be able to provide that in a society in which that's actually become quite difficult. Not many people can do that for each other.
Very true. Yeah, it's interesting. And society definitely has a lot of influence on what people want or think they're supposed to want. So I lived a really interesting trajectory with my wife. So started out, she was a good Greek girl, raised to be a housewife. Her dad literally said, all right, fine, you want to go study film? It doesn't matter. You're just going to end up married and with kids. And he didn't mean it in a horrible way. I mean, that's just how he came up. And so for her, she was very much raised to be a wife and a mother. But she had dreams. But for the first decade of our relationship, she wasn't pursuing it. She ended up writing a book about this. And it was actually really interesting to see the beginning of our marriage from her perspective of like, oh, I've kind of been relegated to this housewife role. I don't know. Like, I know I want to be a mom because in the beginning she did. She wanted 4 kids. And, I know I want to be a mom, but I don't know that I want to be a housewife. And so, but I do want to support my husband. And so like that was the vibe. And then I needed her help at work when we started this new company. And she was like, to support my husband, I will help. No interest in being an entrepreneur. Just, I want to be a good wife. I'm going to support my husband. And then supporting me was like, okay, the job's getting kind of big. Okay, now I'm going to need you to hire some employees. Now you're running a division with 40 people under you and you're responsible for $85 million in revenue and you've got like a 10,000 square foot warehouse and like all this stuff. And it was just like, whoa, how did I turn around and she's now an entrepreneur and like in the thick of it for years. And then realizes actually I don't want kids. I'm getting so much fulfillment out of this and growing and all of that I want to do this thing. And I had to mourn the loss of my housewife. And it's something that we've talked really openly about. And she, as this is all playing out, becoming very different, the dynamic between us is changing. And I was like, I want you to become whoever you want to become. And my value system mandates that I help you thrive in whatever way you want to thrive. But you have to give me the space to mourn that I used to have somebody that was supporting me, cooking all my meals, laying out my clothes, taking care of the house. We were preparing to have kids, all that. And now that's going away. And I'm cool with that because I want you to be who you want to be. But let's be realistic about this is a major change. And so this is going to take some reorientation. And so we talked through it and processed through it. And I actually was very fine not having kids. For the longest time, I was the one dragging her feet. She wanted to have kids right away. And I was like, yo, let's slow roll this here. So I was very fine with that. But that change in dynamic wasn't something that was easy. But to your earliest point on this, we're not battling. Like we're trying to find this thing where we're sharing a life together. And that's how we've always looked at it is, okay, for us, divorce isn't an option. We never say the D word. We don't even joke about it. So I'm never going to be like, oh, if you don't do that, you're going to find yourself out on the street. Ha, ha, ha. Like, nope, we don't play that game at all.
Yeah, we don't either. And this is the other thing that's difficult to say. But if you want to preserve a relationship, that's the sort of attitude that we will take in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases. And there are people who get married and never say a cross word to each other. But they're not the majority. And there are obviously people who are abusive and all of that. But for the vast majority of people, having a relationship that you're not prepared to give up on, either of you, it has to be both of you. It has to be both of you that are not prepared to give up on, is going to make it much more likely that you don't give up on it.
Absolute facts.
And so, again, in a culture where we treat each other much more as objects than we, I think, ever have done before, where, you know, oh, blonde, brunette, you know, get whatever you want on an app, that is much less likely, I think. And also, we're all so much more interested in ourselves as individuals, that again becomes more difficult. So that thing that you're talking about, that's the way. That's the way. It's certainly the way that I've experienced it. The way to fulfillment in a relationship, the way to being together, to being able to have different visions of your future and reconcile them over time and accept that you're not both exactly the way that the other person would like. That's a process, man. That's a process that you have to really, really work on. And in order to do that, when you've got all these other great options, supposedly, you know, it takes that commitment. It takes that commitment, I think. It takes saying, we're not talking about divorce. Because I don't know about you, there have been plenty of situations in which in our relationship, we could have gone down towards that path at least, you know? And to me, you know, all the stuff that we do and whatever, it's inevitable that your relationship with your spouse is going to be the most important thing. It just is.
No doubt.
Just is.
No doubt. Yeah, man. Relationships, it's hard to watch what's happening in the culture now where there's just people having sex a lot less, and you get the, God, I always forget how the stat goes, but it's like a small number of men are
getting all the action.
Getting all the action. Yeah. Right. Nice and easy way to say it. And then hypergamy, which for people that haven't heard that word before, the female tendency to date across and up in the status hierarchy. As women make more money, it becomes a more narrow pool. And if they're not able to broaden their horizons economically, then they find themselves without a mate, or they're competing for that really, really small pool of guys that then aren't, they're not going to commit because they've got so many women coming to them for sex.
And I hear this anecdotally. I mean, I have friends who are like incredible women. Incredible. They're hot. They are successful. They are fucking brilliant, talented, and they find themselves in relationships with guys where, you know, their expectation of what relationship is supposed to be, which is commitment and so on, because the guy that they're with has to be even, in many situations, even
more
richer,
amazing,
even more amazing. He doesn't need to commit. It doesn't need to commit. And there's also another factor here, which is, you know, again, this is difficult to say, but mate value is different for men and women, particularly over time.
Yeah.
And as a woman, as you get older, a guy in his 50s who's a billionaire and successful and famous and whatever, he doesn't need to be dating a woman his age. Right, but a woman in her 50s is not likely to be dating a hot 25-year-old guy. It's just not how that works. So I feel really so much empathy and sympathy and a lot of concern, actually, for women who are in that situation, because they deserve to be fulfilled and to have those relationships and to have the kids that they want to have. But we've got a society where that's more difficult. You know, it's really not a healthy situation, in my opinion. And also, you talk about, you know, people having less sex, and it's true, young people are having less sex than others, and you do have the issue at the top of the sort of male where they're having a lot. But also, there are a lot of women now who are having a lot of sex, not because they actually want to, but because they think that this is the one that's going to take them to the relationship that they want. You see what I mean? And women are now quite often finding themselves having sex in a very masculine male way, where it's like you're supposed to not feel attachment and all of that. And the truth is, that's not really how it works for the vast majority of women. There are some exceptions, of course, but having sex in the male way for women just kind of makes them miserable, you know? And I think that's tragic. I think we should all acknowledge that that's tragic. that a lot of women are doing things that aren't making them happy. But again, for some reason, saying it makes you a bad person.
I think that, so if I were going to steel man why that makes you a bad person, here's what I think is happening.
Yeah.
So people need to know that I'm a worthy person. I'm worthy of love. I'm worthy of respect, no matter what path I choose. And so that's why if I were going to insert like a new way to talk about this, it's like, let's say that I'm a life counselor. And I do this in business a lot. I do this in life stuff. We have something called Impact Theory University. People come and ask me questions, and I'm like, here's how I think through that problem. If somebody came to me with that, the first thing I always say is, okay, what's your goal? You tell me the goal, and then I'm going to try to help you get there. And if you tell me that, okay, my goal is to have a lot of sex, but I don't want to catch feels. Okay, we can do that. But we have to understand there's no solutions, only trade-offs. So if you run that, here are going to be the potential risks given what evolution has primed you for, which is going to be connection, that sex is a high investment thing because from an evolutionary standpoint, you getting pregnant was a big deal. For guys, not so much. Amazing, dine and dash. And they're good, and maybe they have a kid, maybe they don't. But for you, you're going to carry that kid. It's a huge expense. You have to raise them. So that it puts you in a super vulnerable position, all that. So there's a lot of machinery in your brain that's going to be different than the partner that you're seeking who's really wired for that game that you're playing. So we can do it, cool, but like we need to understand what are going to be the trade-offs here. Odds of you catching feels go up a lot. Odds of you finding fulfillment in doing that go down a lot. You're going to be pulling against sort of the evolutionary trajectory, which again, I'm perfectly open to navigating that path. But I just want people to start. This isn't a moral thing. You're not a worse person.
Yes.
But if you're playing when I say a higher risk game, what I mean is that evolution has given you a playbook for fulfillment. There's not only one path. So there are different ways to get there. But like the thing that I think protects Lisa and I somewhat is we understand by not having kids that we're taking the more high risk path to fulfillment because we're doing it through a company. That's part of it. So what happens to my fulfillment if the public that is consuming the product that I make is like, this sucks. Do I get to be fulfilled anymore? Or is it now, well, you didn't get the outcome that you wanted, and so that invalidates my whole life? So we've had to build like thought matrices to deal with that, right? So the way that we combat that is don't value yourself for the end result, value yourself for the sincere pursuit. So did you sincerely try to get a growth mindset out at scale through ideas and entertainment? Yes, but it didn't work. I was never able to quite build the skill set. All right, man, you went for something. You really played to win, and et cetera, et cetera. So, all right, you're going down this high risk path, not risk, necessarily cosmically, just fulfillment is my North Star. I laid that out earlier, what I think everybody should be optimizing for. And so if we can strip some of the judgment away from that, if we can give people a growth mindset so they know, oh, I didn't get what I wanted. Okay, I can try something different and hopefully get something more akin to what I want in another path. So you're not giving up your agency. You know what you want. You established your goal first. You run an experiment. This is literally the physics of progress. You know what your goal is. You see what the obstacle is between where you're at and your goal. You run the experiment. Did you actually get closer to your goal? Yes, no. If no, try again better the next time. You know what I mean? You just repeat the cycle. But if you feel like, whoa, I didn't get what I wanted, that doesn't feel good. I feel judged by you. Now I'm just going to go on the attack so you don't tell me the thing that I'm feeling. And that's where it's like, well, now you can't even navigate well on the higher risk path that you've chosen to get the fulfillment that you ultimately want to feel.
Which is where we come back to the fact that most people are not operating at a level of emotional detachment that you are. And so, and also if you speak to women privately, a lot of them will say that the falling into the trap that I described is not a deliberate thing. They're not going out to go and have lots of sex without catching the feels. If they're actually honest with themselves, not all of them, but many of them, if they can get past the emotion, what they actually want is to date and find a partner to be with for I was going to say the rest of their life because that's kind of my value, but you know what I mean. To settle down with, to have children with, whatever, if that's what they want. But they're not able to do that because they feel that there's a pressure because all the other girls are available to the guy that they're currently with to have sex with on the second day. However, anecdotally, as I observe people around me, the women who don't let that happen straight away tend to end up much more likely securing the partner.
Yeah.
That seems to be a strategy that works better. But you're right. I mean, I'm actually loving this conversation so much, partly because you're showing people a way of operating in the world that is so much more powerful than the way that the vast majority of people operate. Probably to some extent, me included. I don't have the level of emotional detachment that you do in terms of making these decisions. So it's I'm learning.
It's interesting. You have a way, though, of thinking that is very analytical. You're able to articulate very difficult points. So I suppose in the end, this is all a trade-off, because I would kill to be able to do what you do, which now brings us to the triangle of evil, because I want your thoughts on this.
Well, that is a segue, isn't it?
Well, I need your help on this, because this is something that
Let's talk about evil.
Very distressing. Yeah. I think of evil. I think of you, Konstantin. Come on, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, so the triangle of evil is Mao, Stalin, Hitler. And I think that I've read a lot about them, and they feel to me reflective of something that's just real in the human psyche. And I have taken away from reading about them. So oddly enough, Hitler was like sort of the slow boy in all of this, did not kill nearly as many people as Stalin and Mao, which growing up I never heard about. I had no idea that those were dark figures in the world, which is already startling. But reading about them, getting back to this idea of so in fact, we haven't talked about this, but we've sort of danced around it. The way I see the world is it is a scale. So you have right and left just to keep it easy. But there's pathology on both sides. So if you go too far in either direction, you're going to have a problem. It doesn't matter. So Mao and Stalin are what the left look like when they become pathological, and Hitler is what the right looks like when it becomes pathological.
Even in and of itself, that's disputable, but we can get into
Hit me with it.
Well, people don't like to hear this argument, but there's a reason that Hitler's party was called the National Socialists.
Interesting.
And
what does the right then look like if it goes pathological?
Well, this is the debate. I mean, not only Nazism, but also fascism. I mean, the term fascism comes from the word fascia, which is a bundle in Rome that was woven. It's a collectivist mindset. Both the fascist and the National Socialists, on a large number of things, were left wing in the way that we conceive of being left wing now, economically, particularly. We have an interview on our channel with one of my favorite guests ever. He's a brilliant guy called Stephen Hicks, Canadian professor he's a philosopher and historian of philosophy. And if you kind of want to delve into that, I'd recommend people go and check that out, because I won't do it justice here. However, we can also conceptualize it, rather than going as a scale, as a circle, which is, or like a horseshoe or something, where the two extremes end up coming quite close together because they end up operating in similar ways. So it's just a side point, really, for our discussion.
No, it's actually very interesting. So reading about them, seeing that there's this horseshoe shaped where they're trying to control everything, because, and I'll even give them, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and I will say they're not evil. They really believed that they had the right answer. Now, it's tough to look real close and not feel like they weren't just fucking evil, but that's too easy. It's an easy way to dismiss them. Let's say for a second that they really believed in their heart that they were going to do good things for a lot of people. But just real quick, I just have to kill a few of you in order to get everybody in line, because I'm trying to distribute things fairly, or I'm trying to, in the case of
a better world.
Yeah, the case of Nazi Germany, like, hey, we got a bum rap, after World War I, like, we got to rise out of this somehow. And, but I'm going to have to kill a few of you. And I am going to have to make sure that you don't say anything bad against me. And so to distribute everything evenly, we're going to have to kill the kulaks. And, but at the end of this, everything's going to be okay. So what is it about human nature that allows people to think that to usher in the utopia, it's okay to break a few eggs to make the omelet?
I don't know is the honest answer. I think we talked a little bit about collectivism before, and I think that's a big part of the answer to your question. Collectivism is an ideology that justifies the sacrifice of some for the benefit of the greater good.
So the pathology requires the abandonment of the individual's sacredness.
Certainly in the cases that you're talking about, that was absolutely the case. Right? These are not people who believed in the rights of the individual. These are people who believed that for the greater good, some people must be sacrificed. And who knows? I mean, one of the difficult parts of this conversation is, can you run a country like Russia on a Western liberal mindset? This is a big debate among geopoliticians.
Because the people just won't take to it.
It's not so much about the people. It's a pretty fucking hard country to survive in. It's cold. It's remote. It's disparate. It's poorly developed. Can you really make that country exist without authoritarianism? It's a legitimate question, actually.
Why would it need authoritarianism? I thought you were going to say you would need collectivism.
Well, it's both. So you can't have one without the other.
So
really.
you need a totalitarian leader to have a collectivist state.
Is potentially a way of looking at this issue. I'm not committing to that statement, but if you look at the history of Russia, I mean, Russia's never had democracy, ever. There's never been a single proper democratic transition of power in Russia, ever. Ever. It's not the case. There are different ways of conceiving of it. A lot of geopolitical thinkers talk about different types of civilizations, and British and American civilizations. Like this is actually something I have a couple of pieces on my Substack about this, breaking down the philosophy of a guy called Alexander Dugin, who's called they call him Putin's brain. Now, how influential he is in the Kremlin, we don't know exactly, but I break down some of the basic arguments, and the argument is that countries like Britain and America, they're civilizations of the sea. They're trading nations, they're commercial nations, they use the power of their navy, historically speaking, like the British Empire and today the United States, to influence and interact with other countries. Whereas, and this goes back historically, Carthage was a civilization of the sea. This was a trading nation, and they stood in opposition to the Roman Empire, which is a civilization of the land, to the Chinese and the Russian empires today, which are civilizations of the land. And one of the arguments is that civilizations of the land are necessarily collectivist and necessarily authoritarian, because the way that they have to operate in the world is very, very different to the way that trading nations operate, because the values of liberalism, for example, are much more suited to a naval-based trading nation than it is to a land-based nation like a Russia or a China. So to some extent, am I claiming that if it's kind of like that argument about, can you bomb democracy into Afghanistan? Well, it turns out you can't, right? And that's because they have their own culture and their own values that don't really, it's not, having voting booths is not enough for democracy, right? It requires certain other cultural assumptions that don't exist in other parts of the world. So yeah, collectivism seems to be a particular thing that goes hand in hand with authoritarianism, and it makes sense, because if you have a society in which the majority is going to kill a minority or tell them what to do or restrict their rights, and somehow that will require force, inevitably.
Yeah, that's the part that always feels like it's missing from the dialogue of people that want to, redistribute wealth or whatever, is at some point, when you start taking things from one person to give to somebody else, you're going to have to do that by force. Like it won't it won't just happen naturally. And so you really stopped me in my tracks when you said that a collectivist nation requires an authoritarian leader. I had never thought about that before. That's really interesting, because I had always thought about it as just communism requires an authoritarian leader, but I didn't step it back to the collectivist society that ends up giving birth to communism. Also, just by its nature, that's where it's headed. That's really interesting. I don't know how I feel about that.
I don't actually know if it's true. I'm throwing it out there as an idea for us to discuss.
It
I
rings
think it's
distressingly
probably true. Yeah.
I just don't like the way it makes me feel. So so the reason that I call this a triangle of evil is because reading about it was really eye-opening. So I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, not particularly educated on this kind of stuff, then went straight into business as a way to have enough resources to tell my stories. And so maybe when a lot of other people were waking up to what the world is like, I was not. And so I discovered this when I started reading about history. And when you read about history, you start to see the patterns that people are talking about. And you're like, whoa, like this stuff really does repeat. Like this becomes really predictable, which is why it feels like talking about culture is important, because whatever happens to the culture is really going to have profound impacts on the individual, my bias again, and how they either can thrive or not thrive. And so reading about, for instance, how Mao took over China, and what the human tragedy is when you really believe that it's okay to kill as many people as you need to in order to have the power to make the world go the way that you want it to go. And I can't help but keep defaulting back to, if you know what your goal is, and you know the experiment that you're going to run, and you can look at the outcome of this, it's like, hey, this is predictable, that if you try to do communism, because everyone keeps going, well, communism hasn't really been tried, or socialism hasn't really been tried. It's like, but you can run it even as a thought experiment. So even if I grant you, okay, these were all imperfect, the thought experiment should lead you to realize it can't be done perfectly. Like it's not possible, because you're asking every single person to willingly give things up on an equal basis. And when you interface with the world in any capacity, you very quickly realize it's just impossible to get everybody to think the same. And so my read on this is that evolution guaranteed that people don't think the same, that it wants that dynamic tension that we were talking about before. What do you, like, as somebody that grew up in the USSR, what do you say to people that are like, oh, it's never really been tried and we just need to get it right?
You know, in some ways, I almost don't think there's any point in saying anything, because I don't think they're coming from the same place that you come from when you're talking about these things. You come at it from the point of view of, what is my goal? How am I going to get there? I don't think the people who advocate for, fairly extreme forms of socialism or communism, or social democracy, as they call it, but often it's really a disguise for their views. I don't think they're coming at it from the point of view of a goal. I think they're coming at it from a point of view of dissatisfaction with the status quo. And people who start revolutions are operating almost always on that basis. It's not about, I was driving past a shop and I saw a better table. I'll go and buy that table. It's like, this table is so bad, let's throw it out and then we'll find something, right? I think that tends to be how people think about it. And, the thing I always say to people in the West, you talk about the inevitability of it all. As you know, I talk about this in the book. My grandmother, she's not my biological grandmother, but she was my grandfather's second wife, and I always called her my grandmother. She was born in a gulag. She was there because her parents, who weren't married or didn't know each other at the time, had been sent there, both losing their other spouses in the process.
Oof.
And they met there, and she was born in this camp. And what happened once you were released from the camps was you were not allowed to live within a very long distance of the major cities in the USSR. You essentially became a third-class citizen. And what happened was most of the former prisoners of these camps ended up settling in areas and small towns nearby, where they lived together with the local small minority of the local native population, various sort of tribes that had been living there for centuries, and the former guards from the very same camps that these prisoners had been in. In 1953, when Joseph Stalin died, my grandmother and her family, they were living in a tiny flat, tiny apartment. Across the landing, there was another apartment, which was a family where the man was one of the guards in one of the camps.
Jesus.
Living across like this. And my grandmother tells the story how that guy's mother, if the kids misbehaved, she would say to them, you know, when your parents get sent back to the camp,
Jesus,
you're going to get kicked out and we're going to get your apartment as well.
Wow.
Now, 1953, Joseph Stalin dies. And my grandmother told me that there was a spate of suicides among these former guards.
Whoa.
Because what they were doing was finally revealed for what it was. These people truly believed. They truly believed that they were beating these people and torturing these people and killing these people for the greater good, because that's what they were told. And so what I say to people in the West always is, do not be a useful idiot. Do not violate your own moral standards and your own moral rules for the sake of the greater good. There is no greater good than your own moral standards. There is no greater good than that. Do you know, in fact you do because you've read the book, but most people have no idea how the USSR got a nuclear bomb. It was given to them by Soviet sympathizers in the West. And that is why Joseph Stalin, a man who killed millions of his own people, ended up having a nuclear weapon and was able, therefore, to threaten and challenge the West. And that's how you end up with the Cold War. Because people in the West, some of them, were so enamored with their own vision of utopia that they would give the most destructive weapon in the history of the world to one of the most evil men in the 20th century, because they believed in this collectivist vision and they were useful idiots. Do not be a useful idiot. Do not violate your own moral code for anyone, for anything. That's what I say to people in the West.
How do you come up with a moral code?
Well, you're going all Jordan Peterson on me, because when he had me on his podcast, we had a 3-hour conversation about God.
I listened to it, yeah.
Yeah, and it was difficult because the flippant and obvious answer is, it's what I learned from my parents, it's what I learned from the books I read, it's I learned from the society in which I lived, from the movies I watched, and the residual the residual thing that I got out of that. Jordan Peterson will probably tell you it's religion. Other people will tell you something else. I don't have that answer. I wish I did.
Do you think we live in a time where you have to cobble one together?
I've had to cobble one together, yeah. Yeah. Have you?
Yes.
Right. So that's kind of worrying in some ways.
I think it's part of why we're at where we're at.
I think that's what we're talking about exactly. But I also think a moral code, it's not always true, because a moral code will sometimes require you to jump in front of a tank. But generally speaking, a moral code is a good long-term strategy, because it is a way of relating to other people and to reality that is more effective than others. This is one of the things that I find so funny when people say to me, "Oh, Konstantin, you're so brave for speaking out about these."
I actually believe that.
You believe that?
Yeah. It's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on.
Okay, well, what I say to those people, are you fucking mental? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? How is it brave? My ancestors starved to death in the gulags. What, you think me expressing my opinion in public is brave?
Yeah?
Why? That's insanity. There's nothing brave about it. It's my duty to say what I think if I think that something is wrong, isn't it?
Yes.
So why is that brave?
Just because something is right doesn't mean that doesn't demand courage.
Okay, how does it demand courage?
Ooh, that's interesting. This doesn't feel like you could possibly be asking me that question. I love it. We are equally thinking the other person is absolutely out of their minds. Okay, so here's how I look at your life. You are whippet smart, man, and you are really articulate, and you could make a real living even in the Soviet Union if you just like turned a part of your brain off that was like, I'm either never going to talk about these things or I'm only going to talk about them when I'm at home. And I will use the system to my advantage. I will work my way up, which you'd be very easily be able to do because you can outthink people. So I have a feeling if you had just a little evil in you, you could get people to think things were their ideas that were clearly yours. You would manipulate the shit out of them. You would rise to a position of power. And so you could do all of that. And now it would require you to set aside your moral compass or not have one or adopt one out of convenience,
Right.
which I unfortunately think humans are all too capable of doing. So the fact that you don't do any of that, the fact that you are in a Western country in a moment where people really get a certain religious, emotional righteousness out of tearing down wrongthink and the wrong people, and it makes them feel like they have done something good. And it's a sugar version of moral virtue, but it's still like something. It gives them a rush. And so now look, you're not dumb, so you've made a good living out of doing that, and I think your channel's only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But because I'll say in a single sentence why to me you seem brave. You're a contrarian. You don't mind the conflict. You actually posted a hilarious photo of you. Maybe it was a video, I can't remember, on Twitter. It was you with a machine gun, and you said it's
Getting
like
ready to open Twitter in the morning.
exactly. And I was like, that's fucking hilarious. And then I'm not going to do that because I hate that. And my audience, and this may not seem as weird to you because this is the only time we sat down across from each other. My audience is going to find this episode very weird.
Oh, are they?
I've never done an episode like this ever.
Have you not?
Never.
Oh, wow.
So,
Mate, you should have told me. I would have gone easy on them.
No, this is great. I love it. Like I will.
I would have lit a candle,
I appreciate that.
did a little stroking,
It's very kind. No need. But it's so anyway, when I see people that are just completely unafraid to roll up to Twitter with the machine gun in hand, I'm like, all right, you say what you believe in, you're standing for something. I think it's
But what
amazing.
should I be afraid of? This is what I don't understand. What is it that I'm supposed to be afraid of? A bunch of people I don't know and don't respect on a social media platform where they don't even show their face or name saying things about me?
No, you should fear what's happening to Jordan Peterson. He said he's in the middle of 10 lawsuits. As somebody that's been in the middle of lawsuits, let me tell you what a toll they take on you. And
Maybe I'm too stupid and not brave. Maybe that's what's going on.
I don't think you're stupid, but you might be naive to something. Yeah. That is entirely possible. And as you crack, it'll be interesting to see what happens to you when you crack 1 million subs on YouTube. It starts to get different real fast.
Yeah.
And what's happening with Jordan, where he's with the whole Bill C-16, which I can think of no hotter, like that's the nuclear core. And he came to prominence by latching on to the nuclear core. And he has said in his very Jordan Peterson way that if you arrest me, I will, if you give me a fine, I will refuse to pay it. If you put me in jail, I will go on a hunger strike. And I actually think he means it. I think he's so fucking stubborn that he actually will. And in the Gulag Archipelago, there's a great section from Solzhenitsyn where he says, it's really interesting. People come in, you get tortured, everybody breaks. Actually, that's not true. Not everybody breaks. And the people that are so ideologically like convicted, they will let you kill them, and they're all women. And I was like, that is fucking hilarious. Going back to what you were saying about men and women being different. And I just thought, that's my wife. And that's Jordan Peterson, which he has said, I have a more feminine temperament. Like he just will get something in his head, and it apparently, no matter the amount of pain that rains down on that man, he just keeps going. And that doesn't look fun to me.
His life does not look fun to me, but I believe, Jordan isn't perfect. He's a man.
Clearly. And by the way, I think he's amazing.
So do
but
I.
Holy shit, does he sometimes say things? And I'm like, Jordan, are you trying to make your life suck? Like, that's a really dumb way to say that.
But if we come back to the very beginning of our conversation, which is about meaning and fulfillment, I couldn't be fulfilled using my whatever. You're very kind about my intelligence and everything else, using that for things that I fundamentally, I think, are wrong. Right? So
that reads as brave. P.S.
Well, no, what that reads as is not having a choice.
Doesn't read as brave to you. I get that. I hear you.
But I don't have a choice. Bravery is when you're like, well, I could do this, or I could do that. I'll do this. I don't really feel like I have a choice. I feel like it's weird that I have a background that's quite unusual, that is perfectly fitted to the cultural moment at the moment, which is I was born in the Soviet Union. I speak Russian and English. I understand both cultures. I can articulate myself pretty well. I grew up in Britain, so I fit in that culture. I can see it as an outsider, and likewise in America. I can make things funny if I need to. I can be serious if I need to. Like, it's a skill set and a background that not many people have. So what choice do I have?
Would you be a dissident in Russia?
Yes.
Yeah, see, fuck. Do you know...
my whole family were dissidents in Russia, so like it's not a new thing.
That is very interesting.
That's actually one of the things that I wrote a piece on my Substack when my son was born, and I talked about a lot of this. We come from generations of people who were killed for their beliefs. I'm not going to dishonor them.
I'll say it again. From where I'm sitting, that's brave. I want to think that I would be as tough. I don't know if I'd be a dissident in Russia. That's just the honest answer. And it doesn't make me feel good about myself. And the story I will tell myself tonight is going to be that I would work in the underground. But I wouldn't be, I think her name is Nadia from Pussy Riot. No fucking way. And I have met her and had her to the house, and I was just like, what the fuck were you doing? Like, that was my impulse. It was just like, they kill people for doing that. So, yeah, I am terrified that I could ever become the useful idiot. I am terrified that I will get tested by life and come out a coward. So the whole reason that I have changed the tenor of my show over the last 3 years is to not feel like a coward. But I don't know that I'd be a dissident in Russia. I don't know that I would.
You know what? I think the truth is that nobody does. You don't know who you are until you're in that moment. I might turn out to be a little pussy if I go back to Russia, which I don't, for precisely the reasons that we've discussed. I don't think you do know that. I don't think anyone does. But my point is, and this is, it's not a self-obsessed conversation. I don't understand why people keep saying this to me. The things that I'm saying are reasonable things. I do my best to articulate them in a way that people can hear. Sometimes I fail, of course. And sometimes, just like Jordan Peterson, I'm human, right? So I say things that piss people off, and I'm surrounded by people who give me advice on how to say them better, for which I'm grateful. And one of the things that really I found very positive, particularly after the Oxford speech that I did, I get very famous people from the left reaching out to me now and going, can we talk? How about this? Can we discuss this? Giving me advice too, and going, look, if you want to, we can see that in your speech you were trying to reach the other side. Well, if you do, here's a way that you might want to phrase this, right? I see that as reassurance. I see that as a sign of that I'm doing the right thing. But I don't really understand what this is that I'm supposed to fear. Okay, I don't know why Jordan is in 10 lawsuits, but do I think that I need to be? Probably not, I haven't made a massive living out of trigonometry. It's just something that pays the bills at the moment. It will get to a point where, it's massive. I look forward to that moment. I see already in the last few months what happens as you grow. The words you say matter more. People take them more literally, more seriously, and you have to. But it's an exciting challenge, isn't it? And, you know, I remember it's a moment that stuck with me when I was a kid. I went to a boarding school, and so we rarely encountered the parents of the other kids. Well, one time I was watching a rugby game that my friend was playing in, and his dad was on the sideline. And we were talking about a game, an international rugby game that had happened a few days ago. And somebody said to him, well, you know, there was this player, he took the final kick. Imagine that pressure. Wow, that's got to be hard. And this dad of my friend, he said, that's not how you think about it. The way you think about it is, imagine how many people would love to be in the position to have that sort of impact. And that always stayed with me. You know, what a privilege it is. You know, I've just spent however long, you know, before we sat down, and people will think I'm sucking up to you, but we sat down, we were talking about various stuff, and one of them was my business, trigonometry, you know, and I could see within seconds that you've got like one of the most incredible mindsets about that stuff that I've ever encountered. And I get to sit here and speak with you for hours. Where's the bravery? Come on, man. Tens of thousands of your countrymen, many of whom are still alive, stormed the beaches of Normandy. Come on. Come on. More people need to say what they think. And it's not that scary. It's not that hard. And by the way, if more people did it, it would be a lot less scary for everybody. And that's why, you know, I came here from Bill Maher's show. Bill Maher is doing exactly what he should be. He's using his voice to say enough. Enough of this craziness. And guess what? Nothing happens. Especially if you're a multi-millionaire Hollywood celebrity. Nothing happens. And guess what? His audience is now filled with people who were clapping points that I was making. Right? That's what happens when people speak up. So the reason I resist so much this label of brave is not some personal thing. I just think I'm not saying it's true in your case. I'm not saying it's true in other people's cases. But a lot of people want to push that bravery onto me so they don't have to do anything. So they can say, well, I'm not as brave. I'm going to sit here and say nothing. Well, it doesn't take any courage, really. It just takes principles.
Dude, this has been so fun. Where can people follow you?
I'm at Konstantin Kisin everywhere. The YouTube channel is TRIGGERnometry, and the book is An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West.
Everybody, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. Click here now to learn why this generation of men is struggling and feeling lost.
I honestly think that you could look at a man on the street now, point at him, and have a 50% chance that he hasn't had sex in the last year. That's
insane.
What we want is for women to have partners that they are fundamentally attracted to.